The stars shone brightly in the silence of the night, and after the hot day, the cool air felt a pleasant chill on the people sitting in the elegant gazebo. The healer with sharp ears looked closely and seriously at the baby's hand, as if it were some kind of outlandish toy. Finally, leaving the child alone, he settled himself more comfortably on the floor, and the father sitting next to him shook his head sadly. And although the plump and healthy-looking baby was happily cooing in his cradle, he was only expected to live until he was 20, and that was if he was lucky. The head of the estate, David Jones, a dark-haired man with a FAG on the top of his head, was stunned by this news and did not understand why this was happening to him. Whether it was because his wife had been unable to cope and had died in childbirth. A truly pained expression appeared on the young elf's face at these words. He looked reproachfully into David's face. He couldn't even believe that they were saying such things directly to the doctor's face. Besides, how can you speak like that about your own child who is destined to die young? It seems that the baby's 9 yin meridians are torn. In his practice, the elf has never seen anyone's Bai Hui acupuncture point so open. The head of the estate asked whether the Bai Hui was located on the top of the head. The doctor nodded, saying that if it was too open, a person's life would not be long. This is also called ascension of the deity. David had heard that ascension was only possible for powerful Taoists, but the doctor himself considered these stories to be nonsense. Perhaps David has heard of absolute martial arts masters who use the upper meridian of the head, and the Bai Hui point is used. This is the so-called ascension of a deity. A person receives too much energy of the great nature emanating from heaven and earth, and therefore dies, because he is not able to resist such a force. The inconsolable father glanced sideways at his flesh and blood, unable to understand how a healthy-looking boy could not live to old age. He stood up abruptly and turned away from his son and the healer, turning toward the thick branches of the trees. After remaining silent for a few seconds, the man, with anger in his voice, again complained about heavenly punishment, which caused a real storm of emotions on the face of his interlocutor. He exclaimed that after something like that, one could not call oneself a father. But David gently sent the doctor away, adding that the salary would be transferred to him. But the healer was so agitated by the stranger's words that he loudly refused the money and left without saying goodbye. The servants looked after him in bewilderment. On the way home, the doctor muttered to himself that if the child had grown up in the non-traditional sects of the demonic faction, he would have become a heavenly demon. And if raised in Shaolin, he would have been able to use 72 elite combat techniques. The baby will die young in such a remote place anyway, without a chance to live. The doctor adjusted his straw hat, looking at the starry sky. A child, of course, can try to achieve enlightenment on his own. Much remained the same on the estate 10 years later, but the boy's fate was destined to change. David stood up, looking around at his large family at the dinner table, and explained that he had dedicated his life to rebuilding the clan, ever since his late father, Lewis Walker, founded it. Raising the saucer, Jones Sr. announced that if the clan became famous throughout the world, the man would inherit the highest technique of the Monet sect, so he couldn't leave everything halfway. He was also proud of his eldest son, who followed in the footsteps of his late ancestor and joined the sect. The boy was immediately congratulated by his sisters and brothers. The head of the family raised the cup over the table again, loudly calling on everyone to drink in honor of this event. The elder brother of the family suddenly perked up, looking somewhere to the side. Only one chair was empty at this celebratory family dinner, and that person was not there through no fault of his own. The boy turned to his father, nodded towards the chair, and said that Timothy was not yet at the table. The man frowned as he explained that he had ordered him to stay at the training ground, causing his eldest son to cry out in confusion. Now David openly grimaced. He was sure that it would be better for Timothy not to attend such a joyful event, so as not to bring trouble upon everyone. The brothers and sisters exchanged glances while the little ones were playing and not paying attention to the conversation. No one could contradict the head of the family. Meanwhile, that same baby in the past, who was predicted to live no more than 20 years, was training diligently. He tried to use air magic, raising streams of energy from the ground, his eyes tightly closed. Suddenly, the guy looked forward sharply, his entire figure illuminated by a bright blue glow. After a few seconds, everything went quiet and returned to its previous state, and only clouds of thick smoke remained in the room. Timothy looked closely at his own palm, from which streams of mana were still emanating. He finally mastered the art of movement of the Walker clan. With its help, the muscles are filled with energy, which moves a person through space. If his body becomes stronger, I wonder if Timothy will be able to live a little longer thanks to this training. The boy frowned, looking at his own palms and remembering the conversation with his older brother. He asked if Timothy had created a martial art, and he replied that he had done so using the clan's cultivation technique. The clan's eldest son was silent for a few moments, considering what to say to the youngest. Finally, he carefully asked to be understood correctly and sadly scratched the back of his head. Timothy was incredibly surprised, his mouth hanging open, when his relative asked him not to tell anyone about it. The brother's words turned out to be prophetic. The family perceived the news as a new misfortune. The middle brother exclaimed that during the training, an energetic deviation could occur and he would die. Timothy looked at his relative in shock. He was asked if the young man would take responsibility. The father was furious that his wayward son dared to interfere with martial arts. Did he really think he was the founder of a clan? It was painful to look at the unfortunate young man. He looked so puzzled. After all, the founder of the clan is the person who creates the clan's martial arts. And Timothy didn't even think of himself in that way, because he never aspired to it. Looking at his happy family, he just wanted to get better and live with everyone. Timothy was distracted from his heavy thoughts by shouts in the street. People were hurrying somewhere and urging each other on. The guy leaned against the door, watching the crowd, guessing that today was the day the martial arts masters from the sect would visit. The Manhwa sect is one of the 9 great sects in the world, and is one of the pillars known as the strongest associations in Nebraska, along with the Mount Amherst sect. Timothy knew that this was the place where the sword deities were. He wanted to meet them in person. The servant conveyed the chief's order, a ban on showing himself to important guests. Timothy asked if the reason for this was the death of his mother, who gave birth to the boy. The guy smiled at the servant and asked with longing in his voice if the man meant his father. Not knowing what to say, the servant bowed respectfully and asked his master for forgiveness. It would seem that the young man should have long since gotten used to this kind of attitude, but it always hurt him with renewed vigor. Timothy waited until the crowd had cleared and followed. Nothing would happen if he watched from afar. There was something to learn from such skilled craftsmen. The residents glanced at the building where the sect members were rumored to have gathered, wondering who was there. Certainly not a dragon with a heavenly sword, or perhaps an elder. If people like them actually came here, it would be an honor for the clan. The head of the clan and estate, David Jones, came forward with his sons. A few moments later, the crowd buzzed with excitement. The Manhwa sect's martial arts masters had arrived. Trying not to attract attention to himself, Timothy wanted to blend in with the numerous people, and at least see a little of those for whom everyone had gathered. The first to fly out of the building was a beautiful girl with bright hair and a dress of the same color. She moved incredibly gracefully and easily, as if she were flying through the air towards the audience. The girl's appearance truly shocked the people and members of the clan. There were low whispers. Everyone was talking about the fact that a representative of a noble race had arrived. In books, the noble race was described as mysterious beings capable of living forever. Some took them for deities. The girl stopped in front of the astonished crowd, the wind beautifully fluttering the red ribbons in her hair. The aura around her was unimaginable. The main energy concentrated in the body came out completely naturally. The stranger smiled affably, adjusted the hem of his hanfu, and the people standing opposite gasped. Overwhelmed by the awkwardness and grandeur of his guest, David loudly welcomed the girl into the humble clan. For him, it was a great honor. Together with his eldest sons, the man introduced himself and bowed respectfully using the Baekwan gesture. The warrior responded by holding out her blade, bowing slightly and thanking them for such a warm welcome. She identified herself as the elder of the Manhwa sect, Ava Brooks. David's eyes widened, his hands still covering his face, as he realized that the person standing before him was the sect elder from the noble race. He stammered that he was asking for forgiveness for not recognizing the deity itself, but the girl waved her hand. She had not come here to boast about her status. The head of the estate then exclaimed that he had made the sword gods outside wait for so long. After all, they had come a long way. The man apologized for his disrespect. Timothy wondered how long this representative of the noble race, this Ava Brooks, had been alive. At this time, his father invited the sect elder and its representatives to follow him to the estate. As the procession walked along the brick-paved path, the crowd on both sides looked with interest at the unusual guest. She held herself respectfully but not proudly, and nodded in response, holding her gaze on Timothy for a moment. He opened his eyes in surprise when he realized what had happened and was confused, just for a second. The boy immediately bowed his head, showing respect, and folded his hands in a special gesture. David followed the guest's gaze, then looked at his son, whom he did not expect to see here. Timothy immediately turned around, knowing that he would get a scolding from his father later, who had to tell Ava that the child was his third son. The sect elder looked at the boy with approval, saying that he was quite unusual and seemed to be a very smart child. David awkwardly apologized for his son's bad manners, but Ava was surprised by this, not agreeing with the man. Strangely enough, the head admitted that the boy was a real troublemaker in the family. Timothy returned home and immediately reached for his weapon, his hopes rising after seeing the energy of the Manhwa martial arts masters. After learning the Walker clan's art, he didn't know what to develop further, so he wondered what to dedicate his training to. The boy pulled the blade from its sheath. Looking in fascination at the gleam of the steel, Timothy wanted to practice with swords. The arriving sect members were accommodated in a comfortably furnished guest house. The elder Monet sat at the table, her companions looked out the window at the setting sun. This place was even better than they thought. With so much earthly energy, the Tyrant Sword Clan would like to take over this place. Ava, who had remained silent until then, said that sooner or later they would come here, so it was worth coming up with a counterattack. But most likely, it would be necessary to sacrifice the clan. The warriors smiled carnivorously, suggesting that they attack the Sword Clan before they got over the walls. Ava took a sip of tea, thinking deeply about someone else's words. Still, it would be great if this happened. The girl turned her gaze to the elegant dishes in which the fragrant drink was brought. The Tyrant Sword Clan represents the most challenging group of powerful warriors. Ava warmed her hands on the dishes, asking the cult members to remain vigilant and keep their swords at the ready. They assured her that they would certainly be there, and the elder began to drink the hot drink. She herself didn't understand why, but now all her thoughts were occupied only with that child. He clearly stood out from the rest, an extremely strange child of whom his own father was ashamed. Timothy was meditating alone, as always, and something was bothering him. He didn't understand why his intersection connection, Bai Hui, was so open, even though he had hardly meditated for a year due to training in the Walker clan technique. The guy closed his eyes tightly, feeling that the amount of energy passing through his head had become even greater. The body was overwhelmed by bloody energy, which engulfed his entire being. The young master seemed to be on fire. If this continued, he thought, he would lose consciousness in less than half a decade. Timothy woke up abruptly and looked at his palms, realizing with horror that he had less than 5 years left. Sweat appeared on my forehead. These thoughts drove me to real despair, and fear seemed to have eaten into my thoughts. Deciding that the cool night air would at least ease his hot head a little, the young man ran out onto the threshold. Despite mastering the art of movement, the Walker clan is really powerless to stop his own destruction. Suddenly, something terrible broke through the calm of the night, overwhelming Timothy's mind with a sharp force. There was a clear sense of ominous energy coming from the direction of my father's estate. Grabbing his simple weapon, the guy rushed there, deciding that he couldn't stay away. Something was definitely wrong. The closer to home, the stronger the smell of blood. Running up to the main gate, the young man was surprised that it was too quiet. But suddenly, only now, Timothy saw a strange portal, burning with bright colors. It was a formation trap, a cultivation array that traps or immobilizes enemies, and the guy ran into it at full speed. What was hidden from the stranger's gaze turned out to be monstrous, a real catastrophe. All the servants and close associates of the clan were dead. They lay in the courtyard in pools of their own blood, killed with brutal cruelty. Some were caught by death while walking, while others were sitting, leaning against the walls of buildings. Timothy frowned. He had no idea that something like this was happening at the Walker estate. The guy walked further cautiously, trying not to look at the bodies of the unfortunate people. He stopped in front of the girl, whose eyes were filled with horror and tears. Perhaps that trap was to blame for everything. Unable to restrain himself, Timothy closed the eyes of the dead woman. All the dead were people from the Walker clan. Were the killers that strong? Turning his head, the young man discovered survivors, but unfortunately, they were not people of the clan. A big guy with scars on his face was walking towards the boy. He looked at him with crazy eyes, saying that the boy should have hidden if he had saved his skin and not crawled out. The red-haired men nearby, wiping blood from their blades, laughed and ordered that Timothy, who had decided his own fate, be finished off. He looked angrily at the killers and said nothing, slowly rising to his feet. The bald big guy, who had 2 blades hanging behind his back, shrugged and apologized. Orders are orders. The bandit swung his palm to grab the boy with the force generated in it. But, to everyone's surprise, the strong hand was intercepted by a thin, youthful hand. Timothy, without saying a word, squeezed the area closest to the man's wrist with all his might. The skin on the warrior's arm began to burst right there, as if he had been burned by fire. A heart-rending cry of pain echoed through the courtyard. The guy silently watched the killer suffer. Blood from the man's hand splashed onto the floor. The other killers could not even imagine such a turn of events. They turned sharply at the scream and were stunned. The red-haired trio froze, clutching bloody daggers in their hands, their faces lengthened in shock. The big guy's arm was charred and no longer functional. It was simply torn off where the unfamiliar boy had grabbed it. Timothy straightened up, breathing heavily as the energy of the movement arts built up at his feet. The red-haired bandits reached for their blades, behaving more cautiously, challengingly asking who this wanderer was. Timothy held the sword in front of him, energy oozing from his big blue eyes, and exclaimed that he was the third son of the clan leader. Everyone fell silent again, cautiously approaching the young man. The wounded warrior coughed pitifully, holding his lost hand. Timothy took a step towards the mountain of bodies, and the killers leaning over them like predators. Now that same big guy had woken up. He, of course, couldn't leave what had happened as it was. He roared, calling the stranger who had maimed him a bastard, intending to tear him to pieces. Timothy knew that the bandit would pursue him, so he didn't even turn around, making a few swings of his sword. The man's bloody face was distorted in confusion, his wide-open eyes bloodshot. The blood froze in the air for a moment, reminiscent of a blooming garden of red roses. Without turning around, Timothy swung his sword one last time, moving forward. The opponents didn't know who to run to first, the impudent and very strong boy or the fallen comrade. The choice fell on a stranger who definitely needed to be taught a lesson, and a blue flash flashed right next to the face of one of the killers. The guy reached the crowd of people in a matter of seconds and wielded his sword with incredibly fast movements. He left traces of murderous energy on their bodies and continued to run further. Timothy was more focused than ever, glancing back to check what he was leaving behind. As the enemies concentrated and surrounded him, the young man jumped up, attacking them from the side. One particularly furious man immediately paid for his crimes. Someone else's blade ended up in his chest. The young member of the Walker clan jerked the blade out to strike the next assassin. His red robes merged with the splashes of blood from his fallen opponents. Finally, everything became quiet, and the threshold of the house looked like a real field of a terrifying battle. Timothy allowed himself to exhale heavily, resting his palms on his knees and closing his eyes. This is his first training with the magnificent sword, but the boy understands the essence of the action. Someone's voice was heard from behind, lazily saying that everything wasn't so bad. Turning around, Timothy saw a group of men, the shortest, and probably the leader, smirking, calling the slain bandits defeated idiots who had let their guard down. The guy looked questioningly at the uninvited guests, not letting go of his blade. The man admired her again, asking how someone at such a young age could be so strong. Had the boy really dedicated his entire life to training this amazing sword? Taking a closer look at the strangers, Timothy asked if they were members of the Bloodflame clan. The men laughed, replying that these guys were now lying at the boy's feet. The leader straightened up, stretched his neck and folded his arms across his chest, replying that he was from the Tyrant Sword sect. The young man swallowed hard, feverishly trying to figure out what to do when he found himself face to face with such opponents. It is said that the 13 heavens are the most cruel and powerful in all of Murim. Could it be that two blood clans, parts of the 13 heavens, are here now? When Timothy asked what two clans of the 13 heavens could possibly be doing here, the guy was rudely told that it was none of his business. The man from the sect was surprised and asked again when the guy asked if they knew him, since they were answering questions and not attacking. Timothy took a cautious step to the side, watching the stranger's reactions closely. He asked again if they knew that his family was part of the Desert Fortress, the best sect in Murim. That is why if Timothy is killed, they themselves will receive significant wounds despite belonging to the Sword of the Tyrant sect. And even though the guy was just talking, right at that moment, destructive energy passed through the wall of the estate. A man was lifted into the air and then fell to the ground, dropping his blade. Timothy recognized him by his clothes. He was a man from the Monit sect, and he clearly needed help judging by his bloody face. Then the boy heard the sound of rustling hanfu and suddenly looked up. A familiar figure flashed right above his head. The young man tensed and took a defensive stance when the elder of the Monit sect herself appeared nearby. The girl looked a little confused, but Timothy couldn't believe he was seeing her again with his own eyes. The gusts of air nearly knocked her off her feet. Ava tried not to fall, landing on the ground. She used the blade as support and sank heavily to her knees, breathing heavily. The tips of her pointed ears were covered in blood. The Tyrant Sword clan began to look around worriedly, because the girl who arrived was known as the Sword Goddess, but even she was in confusion. So who was the enemy then? Suddenly Timothy felt something that sent a herd of goosebumps running through his body. Ava froze, gripping the hilt of her sword tightly and peering intently towards the destroyed wall. The courtyard was immediately illuminated by the soft glow of a majestic male figure in flowing robes. Timothy had never seen this man before, and now wondered what to expect from him. At first, the man's face was not visible due to his long hair, but it was clear from his rich clothes and blade that this was no ordinary warrior. The stranger radiated such ominous energy that even one of the cruel clans did not dare to move. The man was floating in the air, and suddenly his colorless eyes stopped right on Timothy. The boy frowned, realizing that all his thoughts evaporated from just one stranger's gaze. The man from the tyrant's sword, whom the boy had previously mistaken for the leader, dropped to one knee, greeting the clan leader. Timothy was stunned, not realizing at first that he was hearing the rest of the clan fall to their knees and bow their heads. The stranger stopped, looking at his subjects with an arrogant gaze, slightly shaking his long black hair. He was the man who ruled the Tyrant Sword Clan, which is part of the 13 Heavens and is considered the harbinger of disaster in the Exile Haven. Timothy didn't understand why someone considered equal to the head of one of the 9 great clans would be in a place like this. The guy looked at the frightened Ava and her follower, coughing up blood, and exhaled heavily. In any case, if everything continued like this, then no one would survive here. He decided to take a desperate step. Only someone who did not particularly value his life could do that. Timothy rushed towards the clan members without further words or warnings. He used energy to cross the distance faster. And of course, the head of the sect watched the boy's actions with an appraising eye. The man standing next to the leader, who had spoken to Timothy earlier, reached for his blade in confusion. But the guy was several times faster, running up to the clan member from behind. He seemed to hug him and pierced his chest with a sharp blade. Ava let out a strangled cry, looking at the boy with all her eyes, and the head of the sword of the tyrant was also looking intently at him. Everything happened so quickly that the wounded man could only hiss something, falling to his knees. Timothy found himself surrounded by opponents, but they continued to simply watch. The head of the estate's son rose to his feet abruptly and didn't even bother to pull his blade out of the stranger's back. He looked fearlessly at the dangerous leader, defiantly asking if they would kill him after this. The remaining members of the sect, seeing how their group was brutally murdered, quickly pulled their blades from their sheaths, calling the boy a crazy bastard. But to everyone's surprise, the subsequent actions were interrupted by the leader's words, indicating that they should stop fussing. He stated that Timothy had a better spirit than everyone present put together. The elder of the Munit sect, although she was wounded by this man, smiled slightly upon hearing such high praise. The clanmen couldn't believe their ears. Could their leader really have seriously praised this impudent brat? The leader pierced the boy with a deep gaze through strands of dark hair, saying that he would spare his life. But Timothy seemed to want to be punished. He stood up insolently, without looking away. Having taken his blade from the slain enemy, the boy brought it dangerously close to the head of the clan. He then asked if he could be killed simply because he was the only grandson of the former Divine Sword Squad commander of the desolate fortress. Ava leaned more tightly on her sword, looking at the guy in shock. She was stunned by what she heard. And he was the grandson of that very commander whose squad is the best in the desert fortress? A desert fortress created by the imperial family to prevent the Murim forces from plotting? It's definitely not a good idea to get involved with them. The head of the Tyrant Sword Clan added that this is not the reason why he is leaving Timothy alive. The man allowed himself a slight chuckle, declaring that he liked the guy, which caused shock in the eyes of his subordinates. The boy's character and spirit are what a strong martial artist needs in a haven of exiles. A look of disappointment flashed across the leader's eyes, as if Timothy hadn't been connected to the desert fortress. He would have taken the boy as an apprentice. It seemed that the sect elder and the rest of the clan could not be more surprised, but it happened. After his words, the leader lowered his head, shook his hair, and raised the blade above his head. And the next moment he struck the ground with his tip with all his might, causing bursts of bright light. Leaning on the hilt, the man snapped that he was giving Timothy 1 day to leave this place. By his command, no clan or sect will ever set foot on this land again. In the silence that followed, the head of the Tyrant Sword Clan and his subjects turned to leave. Finally, the majestic man turned over his shoulder to say his final words. Let Timothy find him when he's ready for revenge. The guy just gave the head a murderous look. The courtyard was empty. The last members of the sect had left this place, leaving only destruction in their wake. Ava stood up, clutching her wounded shoulder and looking at the heavily breathing young man. He glared at the back of the enemy who was still beyond his power. The boy already knew what he was about to see in the estate itself and could barely hold back his tears. His father was lying on the ground, coughing and choking on his own blood. The man still had some remaining life force left in him. There were only a few survivors of the terrible massacre nearby. Timothy slowly approached his parent, informing them of his presence. He held out his palms when he saw his father's weak hand, covered in blood, reaching out to him. The dying leader grabbed the stranger's fingers, weakly asking why his son was so strong and how he managed it. Timothy explained that it was all thanks to the Walker clan's art of movement, which he created and mastered. The father's eyes widened in surprise, and he asked again how Timothy was able to create a martial art. The thing is that David had completely forgotten about it because his son had already tried to tell about his creation earlier. Then the head of the family did not even listen to Timothy, responding to his timid words with curses. Right in front of the servants, the man ordered them not to interfere with the clan's martial arts, accusing his son of madness. Timothy was disgraced and humiliated by his own parent, who was never able to understand him. Now, on his deathbed, only now did David turn his attention to his boy, whom he considered the weakest of the entire family. The clan leader's eyes rolled back, and a new stream of blood gushed from his mouth as he whispered the names of martial arts again. However, the Walker clan developed its own sacred art, which was created by young Timothy. Tears of bitterness and regret for a past that could no longer be returned began to flow from the corners of the man's eyes. He admitted that he was so rude and stupid, but the third son created the sacred art of the Walker clan. The father's hands, drowning in regret, gradually weakened and fell downwards. Tears blurred his gradually fading gaze, and David exhaled, telling his son that he had the qualities of a leader. These words struck Timothy right in the heart. He could not have imagined that he would hear such a thing from a cold parent. The eyelids of the head of the family closed forever, and his last words were that the boy was his son. Timothy bit his lip to keep from bursting into tears as he watched his father die. The surviving brother cried out in disbelief, grieving for his deceased parent, who just yesterday had been alive and full of strength. Timothy leaned on one knee, lowering his late father's heavy hand to the ground. He stood up, looking blankly into the distance, while his brother grieved inconsolably, and the chief courtier held his weakened younger sister in his arms. The man approached the young gentleman, addressing him by name. Timothy stopped. He asked what was wrong with Alice, and it turned out that the girl was fine. She fell asleep when her acupuncture point was blocked. Unfortunately, this had to be done in order to hide the baby from the thugs. Timothy approached his brother, asking him to raise Alice in the Monat sect. The girl has an exceptional connection with the five elements, so they will accept her. Still holding his late father's hand, the boy timidly asked what Timothy would do. He straightened up and turned away from his relative, quietly replying that he would take care of himself. While the family was talking, Ava came to the door, reminding everyone of her presence without attracting much attention. The surviving members of the Walker clan asked if the elder was leaving already. She nodded. Together with Timothy, she left the estate now that the head of the tyrant sword sect has intervened in the matter. The girl must immediately inform the Munite sect about this. Ava approached the boy, asking if he was going to go to the abandoned fortress to see his mother's family. After some thought, Timothy agreed, realizing that he had nowhere else to go. Yet there is no longer a place where an orphaned boy can go to improve himself. Ava stunned the guy by offering him to return with her to Mount Monotov. That would be much better. She wanted Timothy to become an adept of the sect leader. He lowered his head, replying that it was a true honor to receive such an offer from the elder of a great sect. This proposal did not go unheard by the elder's followers. They almost screamed. Timothy stopped, looking at Ava in disbelief. He even asked again, deciding that he had heard wrong. The sect elder confidently assured the boy that he could do it. A direct disciple of the Monat sect would be able to master the absolute sacred art. Moreover, the sect leader is one of the few leading martial artists ranked among the top 10 sword masters in the world. Timothy bowed, folding his hands in a respectful gesture, saying that he would not forget this great kindness that Ava had shown him. After remaining silent, the guy added that he had to apologize, which drew surprised looks from his followers. Ava smiled, asking Timothy not to worry about it. She just wanted someone talented. The head of the Sword of the Tyrant probably thought the same. The boy apologized again, and the elder waved her hand, assuring him that the doors of the Monat sect were always open to the son of the late head of the estate, and he should not forget that. Timothy felt extremely awkward, but he could not agree to such a generous offer now. A little later, as dusk fell over the valley, Timothy asked if he could ask Ava a question. He knew that the girl was one of the oldest beings among the noble races, but did the elder know how to obtain the fruits from the world tree? Ava was extremely surprised when she heard such a question from the boy's lips. The fruits of the world tree were guarded by the head of the desert fortress, whom the emperor recognized as his equal. They say that these fruits grant eternal life and youth to those who eat them. It is a treasure of heaven. Timothy secretly hoped that he could live much longer than his allotted life with the help of this fruit. Ava paused, explaining that she hadn't lived even half her life, so she had no power over the world tree. All she knew was that the head of the desert fortress was capable of giving them to the people. Timothy said that he had to go to the desert fortress. The elder shrugged. Getting the fruits would not be easy. They are sacred items even for noble races. The guy has no other choice, so there's nothing he can do. All he could do was become the commander of the Divine Sword Squad and accomplish great feats. Ava bowed to the boy, raising the hilt of her sword in front of her, promising to support his choice. The sect elder then announced that it was time for her to take her leave to report what had happened to the sect. She left a sword master and an apprentice to help Timothy clean the estate. The men immediately folded their hands into fists and touched the other with an open left palm. The wind swayed Ava's long clothes and hair. The boy looked after the elder. When she had almost disappeared from Timothy's sight, he too folded his hands in a respectful gesture. At dawn, when the estate had been cleared of bodies and endless blood, the boy solemnly thanked the swordmaster and his apprentice for their help. The entire clan gathered to pay their respects. The men bowed, assuring that there was no need to thank them. They suddenly looked down, timidly declaring that they themselves, one might say, played a role in this tragedy. Silence fell over the clearing until Brother Timothy called his name. He hugged his sister and timidly approached his relative, awkwardly wondering how to start the conversation. Finally, he looked up guiltily, saying that he understood that an apology couldn't make up for everything that had happened to the boy in the Walker clan. When they met again, the guy promised to be a good older brother for Timothy and do everything in his power. He also hoped that everything would be fine with his younger relative. In response, Timothy said that even though his brother would be studying the martial arts of the Manhwa sect at a rather late age, the boy would succeed. At least that's what he wanted to believe. And he needed to train as if his whole life depended on it. Timothy turned his gaze to the baby, who timidly squeaked out her uncle's name. Smiling at the girl, the boy asked his older brother to protect Alice, who nodded decisively. Then the son of the deceased head turned to the chief courtier, asking where he would go. The man bowed and said that there were small branches of the Walker clan in various places in Fort Worth, and since the clan's bloodline was alive, the courtier would take care of the remaining ones. Timothy announced that he was going to the desert fortress, hoping that he would be able to see his family from time to time. The man bowed and nodded, and the boy thought that since the chief courtier was skilled in martial arts, he should be able to handle it. Finally, Timothy turned to the clan, telling them to enjoy life and take care of themselves. Nodding once again to everyone, the guy walked on, intending to reach the desert fortress. The chief courtier looked at the young master's back in surprise, considering his wish. He bowed respectfully again, knowing he couldn't even remember anyone from Clan Walker ever saying anything like that. Deep night had fallen on the city of Louisville, but the windows in the houses were welcomingly lit, illuminating the way for travelers. The central streets seemed to never sleep. Crowds of people scurried back and forth, enjoying the evening coolness. Timothy headed to the inn, one of the noisier ones with a restaurant next door, not too expensive. Having rented a room for the night, he went up to the top floor to view the city from above. Timothy finally arrived at his destination, planning to rest and then find his mother's family. The guy was pulled out of his thoughts by the voices of the guests discussing how incredible the desert fortress was. People come here from all over the Central Plain, and the manager here hit the jackpot, saying that all the booze ran out due to the influx of guests. A tipsy guest said that lately there has been real chaos in the taverns. Martial arts masters get drunk, even though they come to take entrance exams. Timothy was surprised because he had not heard before that the desert fortress had entrance examinations. Suddenly, a stranger approached the guy's desk, a young guy about his age, and towered over him, asking if Timothy had come to try to pass the entrance exams. Walker raised an eyebrow, asking a counter question. The guy immediately scratched the back of his head and apologized for not introducing himself. He was just very surprised to find someone younger than himself here. Winking at his interlocutor, he gave his name and hometown, Howard Collins from Honolulu, which is quite far from Louisville. Taking a sip of long-awaited tea, Timothy introduced himself, hoping that the stranger would go his way. But he cleverly took the empty seat at his new comrade's table, which drew a displeased look from Timothy. But he completely ignored it and began to say that his interlocutor's path had certainly been easy. Howard said that he had to work hard fighting off bandits in the Green Forest and battling pirates, and the latter were really hard to deal with. But Timothy no longer listened to the annoying new acquaintance, remembering how he himself had met a group of robbers, whom he had defeated in no time. At night, the boy had to sleep in the open air, wrapped in just a cloak. Taking another sip of his drink, he replied curtly that his journey had indeed been quite easy. Closing his eyes from fatigue, he didn't immediately notice Howard looking around, checking if no one could hear them. Getting closer, he whispered right into Timothy's ear, asking if they could be friends and help each other during the testing. The son of the head of the Walker clan raised an eyebrow and asked again what testing they were talking about. Howard stared at his interlocutor in surprise, almost falling out of his chair from astonishment. He stood up and leaned his hands on the table, exclaiming how it was possible not to know about the trials of the desert fortress. The desert fortress is very different from ordinary martial arts sects. To get in, you need to pass trials, With their help, judges test the participants' knowledge of literature, martial arts, and much more. That is why, even at this time of day, there were so many people gathered here. Whether Timothy has experience or not, if he joins the participants, he will be given the opportunity to learn. There are a lot of martial artists here. Many people have learned different martial arts just to pass the test. The Desert Fortress is the strongest fighting group in the world of martial arts, which inevitably makes everyone's heart beat faster. And people would say, if you want to conquer the world with only one weapon, then go to the Desert Fortress. The imperial family, which rules the Central Plains, has collected all the elixirs and best martial arts techniques from all over the world in the fortress to control the martial arts groups. Howard said with a smile that some people say that traditional sects are much better, but they themselves don't know what they're talking about. How could the fighting groups created by commoners be stronger than the Desert Fortress? If that were possible, they would have already created an empire and become rulers. The guy enthusiastically told how almost no one managed to pass the Desert Fortress test on the first try. Perhaps one person in 1,000, but even then, these are usually the heads of the next generation of respected martial arts clans. With a conspiratorial air, Howard approached his new friend, offering to go to the test together the next day. And although Timothy did not express the slightest interest in what he heard, he shrugged and agreed. His overly active acquaintance fell silent for a moment, scratching his cheek in surprise. Then he started chatting again, saying that Timothy was easygoing and they would get along. Maybe the boy would be a little confused, but it was worth repeating after Howard. The heir of the Walker clan thought that he was happy about the upcoming trials to get to the Desert Fortress. He did not want to ask for help from his mother's family, simply not knowing where they were. The next day, the boys came to the city gates, over which the district flags were flying. As the crowd approached, Howard raised his head, looking around with interest. Timothy also stopped, examining the gate, but his new acquaintance immediately hurried him. The guy nodded, tension and excitement growing in his chest at the same time. Finally, after so much time, he was able to find himself in the Desert Fortress. A little later, when the number of participants was distributed, Timothy received a wooden plaque with his number. It will be 13th. The guy muttered something under his breath, looking at his number. Well, nothing can be done. Timothy raised his head and looked around, examining the other participants in the upcoming competition. A crowd of people gathered around a simple wooden fence that separated the spectators from the contestants. The guy assumed that the judges, two serious-looking men, were standing directly opposite. They and the contestants were separated by a large field, marked with small squares. Howard quietly explained to his friend the rules of the first exam. If the examiner takes the tablet away, then you passed. If they ask you to return it to the registrar, then you're out of luck. The new acquaintance continued to tell me that the tournament would take place during the second exam. When Collins suddenly became serious and silent, Timothy asked worriedly what was going on with the third exam. For some reason, he became thoughtful, scratching his nose with his index finger for a long time. Finally, Howard, on the way out, said in a mysterious tone, "An interview with the head of the Desert Fortress." The son of the Walker clan almost dropped the number from his hands, amazed by what he heard. There are martial artists who come to Fort Worth just for this chance, and speaking with such an absolute master is an incredible opportunity. That is why people hope to ultimately receive wisdom or advice, so striving to win. Timothy nodded, saying that he understood everything, and clutched the wooden plate with the number tighter in his hands. At that moment, the examiner announced in a loud, well-trained voice that the first exam was devoted to the art of wielding the swiftness of the sword. Contestants must demonstrate one swing using the fastest technique they possess. Well, the examiner himself will observe and, of course, evaluate the skills. To everyone's surprise, a flushed Howard ran forward, raising his hand and shouting that he wanted to go. He glanced sideways at Timothy, who was standing calmly, realizing that he had been nervous and had volunteered, while his comrade was thinking that he simply needed to demonstrate a quick sword technique. The guy slowly untied the threads of his cloak. It seemed that everything looked simple enough. Meanwhile, Howard tried to calm down and pull himself together. He grabbed the blade with both hands. Timothy decided to observe how his new acquaintance would cope. Yet, despite his nervousness and haste, it was clear that Howard had a well-honed spirit and was strong. Even stronger than the bandits Timothy met on the way to the Desert Fortress. The reluctant volunteer took a deep breath and abruptly pulled his sword from its sheath. Holding them in one hand, with the other he described a large circle with the sword in the air. The air shook under the force of the impact, and the examiners kept their eyes on Howard. The spectators were chatting admiringly, saying that the boy was emitting extraordinary energy. They had never seen anything like it. The demonstration continued for several more minutes when Howard finally stopped and stood before the stern examiners. He was breathing heavily, looking askance at the chief judge, waiting for him to speak. The man's face opposite was completely expressionless. He froze and remained silent. The seconds dragged on so slowly that Howard was already losing faith. But suddenly the examiner reported that everything had gone well and asked to give him the board. The guy thanked him and stepped aside, and in the meantime the next test subject was called into the arena. Howard wished Timothy good luck. He nodded and became serious, gathering his strength, hoping that he would perform with dignity. The people behind the fence were whispering, but the son of the head of the Walker clan listened only to his own thoughts. The observers were slightly surprised that this young man also came to take the exams. Howard smiled as he watched his friend go, hearing the onlookers say that this young swordmaster had guts. If he was from another province where he could demonstrate swordsmanship in front of the desolate fortress martial artist, getting advice would be very valuable. The steps towards the examiner seemed endless to Timothy when he stopped in front of him. The distance between the master and the subject was not too great, but not too close either. Timothy nodded respectfully, lowering his head and closing his eyes, concentrating. The examiner chuckled and nodded in response, his face just as inscrutable. When the guy was given permission to begin, he immediately perked up and straightened up, summoning all the energy he had accumulated. The sword burst from its sheath with a pop, and the first coils of magic appeared on the stone floor. With one swing of the blade, Timothy tried to show everything he was capable of and demonstrate the martial art of movement he had created. The air vibrated to such an extent that even the formidable swordmaster retreated. The audience and the other subjects gasped, their mouths hanging open. They had never seen anything like this before. It seemed that not even a second had passed before the alien sword described several circles in the air. No one understood how the blade appeared, and Howard, watching his friend, opened his mouth in amazement. Timothy bowed and calmly hid his weapon while the examiner chose his words. A few moments passed before he loudly announced that the future of the desert fortress was right here. Such a high rating amazed all observers. Amazed cries were heard in the crowd. The swordmaster asked the subject for a small tablet, and Timothy obediently handed it over, holding out his hand. The examiner brought it up to his eyes, read the number, and chuckled thoughtfully. He narrowed his eyes, looking closely at Timothy, and asked him to stay on his way. The swordmaster called the next participant. Timothy quickly put on his cloak. The crowd parted, silently looking at the exceptional winner of the day, and Howard came to his senses and ran after his friend. He called the boy, cautiously asking if he was the son of a famous family. Timothy shrugged, saying that it didn't change anything, since after joining the desert fortress, he heard that all that mattered was martial arts. Howard was surprised to realize that his friend was actually planning to take the desert fortress test. Timothy looked over his shoulder. He thought that was what everyone had come for. Howard wanted it himself? It seemed that for the first time in a long time, the frivolous guy was thinking deeply about the future. He paused for a moment before replying that this was indeed the case. Howard bowed respectfully to Timothy, thanked him, and announced that he was leaving. Timothy nodded, watching his new acquaintance. He hoped that the kind and talkative Howard would pass the second exam. The next day at the inn was spent in continuous meditation for the child of Clan Walker. He trained hard despite his fatigue, sweat running down his young face from the effort. The second exam is a tournament in which you have to compete with others in martial arts. Timothy reached for his blade. He had 3 weeks until the second exam. Considering this, the right choice would be to maintain his skills. The boy planned to train the Walker clan's art of movement and the art of wielding a swift sword. The ability, writing the origin of ability, a technique for enhanced chi movement. No sooner said than done. Days passed, sometimes nights of hard training. 3 weeks passed, and the subjects were escorted to the exam location by a special person. He brought the participants to the gate and ordered them to wait there until everyone was called. The wide gates closed. The same escort stood guard next to them, and the crowd of participants remained outside. The participants, languishing in anticipation, began to examine the man who had brought them. Several subjects noticed the white clothes of the escort, and this was somewhat disconcerting. Some people have heard that a white suit signifies a beginner-level martial artist, but still, his energy was incredibly strong. Apparently, even just wearing a white uniform means that the future of the participants is promising. This is exactly what Timothy thought about when he thought about his fate. He was pulled out of his thoughts by Howard, who was as cheerful and energetic as ever, running up to greet him. He began measuring his height and that of his friend, exclaiming that he had grown a little. Timothy said with a smile that Howard looked good too. The guy beat his chest and proudly announced that he had indeed achieved something. He decided to remind his friend that winning was not what mattered in this exam. Even simply participating in one of the 2 matches of the tournament is enough to catch the eye of one of the masters of the Desert Fortress, who will be observing the progress of the tournament. Even though this was the hardest part, Timothy asked, "Even if we win 2 matches, they might still not let us go further?" Howard bit his finger and frowned, nodding. He said the problem was that the exam directors would have higher standards today. The guy heard that someone named Evans Graham was participating in today's Desert Fortress Challenge. Timothy, who had seemed calm until then, looked at his friend with wide eyes. Everyone knew this name, a truly great warrior, Evans Graham from St. Louis. He managed to destroy a notorious group of bandits before his 13th birthday. The boy beheaded the swordmaster of an unconventional sect, a hidden assassin. Rumor has it that he defeated all the top fighters in the Dragon and Phoenix tournament of the 8 great families when he was only 18. Timothy didn't understand why a young fighter from the Graham family would join the Desert Fortress. Howard whispered that because Evans was the child of a concubine, he would never be the head of the clan. If one rises to the position of Lord of the Desolate Fortress, it is equivalent to the position of the head of the 8 great families, with much more power than a simple clan head. The Desert Fortress maintains order in Exile's Haven, in the heart of the Central Plains. At that moment, the escort's cry was heard. He invited Timothy to come forward. The guy immediately became serious, and Howard next to him was taken aback by such a sudden change in the situation. Timothy hoped that they would see their friend again, here in the Desert Fortress. Such serious words surprised the guy. He froze for a few moments, blinking in confusion. Then he nodded in agreement, watching the straight back of his new comrade. The swordmaster frowned at the one who had done so well on the first task. The rest of the participants simply silently assessed the strength of the subject, staring at him. Timothy's future opponent was several decades older than him. He smirked as he unsheathed his sword, seeing such a young member in front of him. Before Timothy could draw his blade, the examiner loudly announced the start of the duel. His opponent, holding the blade in front of him, suddenly bowed his head and chuckled softly. The guy raised an eyebrow, looking in surprise at the older man, who looked incredibly strange. He stuck out his tongue, hissing that the young man was probably in despair, didn't know his place in the world, and resembled a moth circling in the light of a lamp. He wanted to say something else, to introduce himself pompously, but not a moment had passed before he had lost several teeth at once, and a mark from someone else's boot appeared on the braggart's face. At some point, Timothy hit his opponent so hard that he fell to the ground and blood spurted from his mouth. The boastful warrior, who had done nothing to show off his skills, now lay on his back, his mouth open in disgust. Timothy himself seemed surprised by the force of his blow, seeing blood on the scabbard of the blade. He straightened up, regaining control of himself, his lips pressed tightly together. It was unknown how the examiner would evaluate his attack. Meanwhile, the enemy was whining softly without closing his mouth, and tears were frozen in the corners of his eyes. Timothy watched silently as the man was dragged by the legs by 2 assistants. Silence reigned. The other participants were also silent, looking at the young warrior. The famous Evans Graham himself watched this short fight and smiled. Then he stepped forward, asking if he could try, attracting the winner's attention. Evans was tall, very handsome and stately, his dark eyes piercingly appraising Timothy. The guy turned over his shoulder and now looked warily at the warrior. Timothy didn't answer, the swordmaster was silent too, and Evans came closer. There was a chuckle from the crowd, and someone said that it had finally happened. Everyone was wondering who would take Graham, because the squad leaders would fight for him. He seemed to be the strongest. However, no one expected anything less from Evans, knowing his past exploits. Timothy heard whispers and only now realized who exactly had come out to him. Could this guy really be the famous Evans Graham that Howard was talking about? The audience wondered if they would be able to witness the boundless heavens technique today. Timothy looked at Evans, and it seemed to him that he was about 5 years older than him, and did not seem to be at a level that Walker himself did not possess. Thanks to his family's fighting skills, Timothy was in better physical shape than Evans, but still inferior in other aspects. Meanwhile, his future opponent came closer and, raising his sword to his face, bowed. He calmly introduced himself, saying that he mainly trained in the boundless heavens and endless steps techniques. Saying it was a pleasure to meet you, Evans drew his blade from its sheath with a sharp movement, the blade glinting in the rays of the sun. In turn, Timothy also bowed, replying that he had been trained in the art of movement by the Walker clan. Evans raised the blade to his face and looked questioningly at his opponent. He never drew his blade, so Graham asked him if he was going to use the weapon. The question remained unanswered. Timothy leaned forward slightly, reaching for the blade. He froze in this pose without moving, apparently inviting his opponent to speak first. He lowered his eyes and chuckled softly, and a confident smile lit up the guy's face. Pure and powerful energy flowed through the air. He held the blade in front of him. Timothy watched Evans closely, shaking his hair and leaning forward. Now his energy rushed forward, playing with blue flame on the hilt of the weapon. The main essence of the technique that the guy has been practicing lately is unpredictability. A surprise main attack with an unpredictable rhythm. If done correctly, he can force the enemy to lower their guard. This would certainly help Timothy defeat such a strong warrior. The rest of the participants braced themselves for the promising spectacle that was sure to unfold between these two. The examiner held out his palm, counted from 5 to 1, and loudly ordered to begin. Once again, it didn't take long for Timothy to be at Evans's side, who used his sword to cut through the other man's blade, leaving his opponent with a stump of the weapon in his hands. Graham clutched the sword in both hands, looking at Timothy, who was looking at him from below from under his brows. For some reason, the boy didn't look defeated, and that was discouraging. The broken tip of the junior member's blade landed on the stone floor with a loud thud. Both subjects froze, as if not understanding how this had happened, and the other participants looked at them in surprise. Timothy took a few steps back and looked at the stump of the weapon in his hands in confusion. What is this? The spectators rubbed their beards. Evans had won. What a terrifyingly magnificent sword. Even the most confident spectators were now flushed with tension, not imagining what they would have to face. Graham himself frowned and lowered his head, examining his own weapon with displeasure. Then he lowered his sword, looking at Timothy, who stopped looking at his blade and looked at his opponent. Evans suddenly smiled softly and said something that threw everyone around him off balance, that he had lost. It was funny to look at Timothy's face. His eyes were so wide and his mouth was open in silent shock. The spectators blushed. Such words from the absolute winner sounded wild. Now everyone started talking about Timothy's frightening and amazing sword, which, moreover, was at least 5 years younger than Evans. When the latter returned the blade to its sheath, everyone asked questions about whether the young fighter could use true energy in his techniques. As it turned out, a powerful martial arts master was hiding in the boy's hometown. It's scary to even imagine what he will become. The examiner approached Timothy, asking his name, who immediately straightened up and nodded. The swordmaster pointed to the north, saying that there would be another garden in that direction, and that they had to wait there. As he said goodbye, Walker approached Evans and bowed, saying that he would be very glad to fight the hero again. He smiled sincerely. He wanted to say the same thing and would look forward to it. TD nodded and walked out of the building, passing through the main gate, heading towards the garden. The other participants looked in surprise at the young test subject. So young, and yet he was able to pass the second exam. Everyone was confident that Evans Graham would enter first as the true winner. Timothy heard other people's words and suddenly stopped himself, thinking about the duel. He knew that he wouldn't have a single chance of winning if the fight dragged on, which is why, as soon as the duel began, the boy used the most extreme form of the magnificent sword he knew. However, due to Evans infusing his sword with his true energy, Timothy's blade broke. It was a misfortune on the boy's part due to the reckless use of the magnificent sword. But instead, Graham, to everyone's surprise, admitted defeat. Perhaps the nobility of a famous family. Even the other participants were surprised, thinking that the young man could not yet use true energy in his techniques. Clan Walker is a third-rate branch of the clan in the local area. If there had been someone at home who knew how to use such a skill, Timothy would never have learned it. However, now the guy knew this. Now it dawned on him how best to do everything, only when his own mistake became obvious. Timothy tried his best and put energy into what was left of his blade. Now he understood that it was not as simple as simply charging the weapon with energy. Timothy could use the true energy as a means to become one with the sword. The subjects, who had gathered in a group and were discussing something, turned their heads at once upon noticing the light. It was so bright that it couldn't go unnoticed, and the men were dumbfounded. The young man was emitting incredibly strong vibrations, and it became clear that there was a resonance with the sword. But this had never happened before, because the fighter was too young for this. And yet people saw it with their own eyes. It was impossible to deny what was happening. It feels like the sword and Timothy's body have become one. It must be the union of the body and the sword. A new sword technique that the boy will use in battles. Looking at the stump of the dagger and feeling its incredible power, Timothy smiled like a child. He heard footsteps and came to his senses. Evans was standing next to him. He congratulated the enemy on his enlightenment. At first, Timothy didn't understand why he came at that particular moment. But then he noticed that the warrior was holding the hilt of his sword in front of him, and the crowd was looking at them thoughtfully. Was Graham protecting him out of fear that someone might stand in the way of the young man's enlightenment? Timothy hesitated for a few seconds, but then said he didn't know Evans was protecting him and thanked him. He then congratulated his opponent on passing the Desert Fortress test. Evans was stunned for a moment, looking at the young man in surprise, not understanding what he was talking about. But the next second he threw his head back and burst out laughing, which in turn surprised Timothy. Only now the guy noticed Howard standing next to him. He raised his hand to indicate his presence. Timothy congratulated his friend. Howard perked up and exclaimed, asking Walker if he knew he had a nickname now. The boy responded to the puzzled look by saying that when someone demonstrated exceptional fighting skill or attracted attention, people would give them a nickname and then address them that way. Most nicknames represent great honor for martial artists, not counting those who commit chilling acts. Cliff Swordsman, White Killin. These are all nicknames. Evans smiled and said he had heard about it too, and Timothy shrugged. He had just passed the test. White Killin looked at the guy seriously and called him by his nickname. Lightning Genius, Lightning Technique, Light Skill. That's what the participants saw when Timothy fought. Even the martial artists of the Desert Fortress called Timothy that. It turns out that this is the nickname of a young man in the Haven of Exiles itself. Timothy wondered why his friends thought they weren't making fun of him in the same way they would have made fun of someone who was just a little bit skilled with a sword. The guys rolled their eyes, and Evans said that if this was a little for Timothy, then he himself was a complete zero. Lightning Genius. Timothy Walker is a name the boy never even dreamed of when he was training on his estate. Finally, the examiner ordered everyone to gather around a tall, multi-story building. There is one last test left. If the participants pass it, they will join the Desert Fortress. Timothy raised his head, peering into the high vaults, imagining the future. A living part of history and one of the strongest martial artists, meeting with the leader of the Desert Fortress. There were now far fewer volunteers, as the task required incredible concentration and confidence. Not much time passed when the next test subject, who was walking briskly through the door, came out. Now, appearing and coming out of the shadows, everyone gasped when they saw his face. Howard was shocked by these changes. This was not the reaction he expected. The man was exhausted both mentally and physically, and wandered towards the exit as if in a dream. Everyone came out pretty quickly and looked really shabby. Did the boss just watch and say nothing? Finally, it was Timothy's turn. The guy glanced at the door with slight fear. But there was no other choice because it was necessary to finish the job once it had been started. The examiner ordered to go up to the top floor of a tall building. Having climbed many stairs, the guy found himself in front of a majestic gilded door. A few seconds passed and it slowly opened with a loud creak. Timothy gave himself a few seconds to gather his courage and go inside. He held the sword tightly in his left hand and suddenly looked down in surprise, noticing flowers growing on the floor right in the room. Long tree roots stretched across the floor, giving the place a strange atmosphere. Having reached a large window, next to which a stranger was sitting on a bench that literally grew out of the tree, Timothy stopped. This person is a young-looking girl with pointy ears and a bored look, the head of the Desert Fortress, considered to be one of the strongest in the world. She didn't even turn away from the window, but sat silently with her eyes closed when Timothy introduced himself loudly. And only then did the girl slowly, as if reluctantly, turn to him, shaking her bright hair. The guy, who had been standing calmly until then, leaned back in surprise as if he had seen some kind of miracle. And it was indeed so, the appearance of the head of the Desert Fortress. Her incredibly deep green eyes were striking. She suddenly spoke up, saying that Timothy was related to this child. He looked at the girl with incomprehension. Did she really know his mother's family? The head of the Desert Fortress crossed her legs. It seemed the guy had finally realized it, and he wasn't one to be timid. Timothy nodded, confirming that he was the grandson of the former commander of the Divine Sword Squad. The girl said that he would soon become part of the Council of Elders. This man does not give up so easily. The chief fell silent, looking closely at Timothy, then said that he was wounded. The guy didn't think it was serious, just normal family matters, nothing to worry about. But the girl didn't think so. Moreover, everything was hidden by the young man's trained body. She closed her eyes, leaning against the back of her bed, saying that the subject had probably only lived for about 15 years. But it's not worth it for a stranger to interfere in this, and this issue still needs to be resolved. Timothy bowed and asked forgiveness for his ignorance towards the chief. The extraordinary look the girl exudes as someone with absolute power is the topic of conversation, not his family problems. Suddenly, to Timothy's surprise, the head of the group rose gallantly from her seat. Straightening up, she looked down at the guy and said that she liked him. It was funny that he didn't even bow his head, although he didn't come here just like that. There was something that Timothy really needed. Does the girl really know that the guy came for a specific purpose? And does she know that his acupuncture point, Bai Hui, is too open? Walker then decided to ask if someone like him could survive if he ate the fruit of the world tree. The headmistress glanced at the boy with her emerald eyes, smiling and saying that there was no absolute information about this yet. Timothy winced. His heart skipped a beat for a moment. Was there really no hope? But the next moment the girl nodded, saying that he could get what he wanted. Timothy will be able to get the fruit, but everything will depend only on his actions. Even this answer satisfied the warrior, and he sighed quietly to himself. He pressed the sword to his chest and bowed, thanking her for those words. They were enough. As Timothy straightened up, he froze in place, remembering something important. He looked at the leader in surprise, asking in confusion if he was now the martial arts master of the desolate fortress. The girl smiled, confirming his guess, and allowed the next commander of the Divine Sword Squad to go. The young swordsman looked at the girl with extreme seriousness from behind his thick bangs, and she smiled surprisingly kindly, with laughter splashing in her green eyes. Timothy walked thoughtfully down the long corridor towards the stairs, pondering the leader's words. It's unclear whether the girl was joking about him, or whether she actually saw some potential. Some strange thought took shape in the young warrior's head, and he stopped. Was this a hint that Timothy would be able to obtain the tree's fruits if he became the squad leader? The young man immediately imagined himself standing in red robes, strong and powerful. A little later, 2 more people came out of the building where the leader was, Evans and a man unfamiliar to the company. Howard also successfully completed the task. He looked incredibly stupid from uncontrollable joy. Timothy remained focused, looking around carefully. 4 figures, among whom the youngest was Timothy, followed the escort. He chuckled softly. There had only been 4 successful candidates to date. The man looked over his shoulder and asked if the participants knew what the main purpose of the desert fortress was. Howard nudged Timothy in the shoulder, smiling as if this was the revelation of the martial arts master's insidious plans. The guide nodded, noting that that was not all. There was a certain order of actions that had to be followed. It also includes preventing conflicts in the martial arts world in general. The 4 subjects were dumbfounded, their eyes wide open. They had never heard of such a thing. No one can predict how a battle in the martial arts world will turn out. Today, when the land is filled with rumors of the revelation of the new location of the heavenly demon's tomb, the central plains may be flooded with blood. It would be fine if those who thirsted for secret techniques and combat elixirs fought only among themselves, but the cruelty of greedy martial arts masters affects not only other masters, but also ordinary people. To witness these hellish events again would be like returning to the pre-imperial period. Howard's expression grew serious as he recalled the incident with the Sky Demon's tomb out loud. The guide, without turning around, continued, saying that 17 whole years had passed since that terrible moment. The problem wasn't just him. The old factions and the 8 great sects were also adding to the trouble. If left unattended, the common people will suffer. And if the people are dissatisfied, it will make it difficult to collect taxes and create problems for the government. That is why the imperial family spends a colossal amount of resources on maintaining this place. Finally, the man led the test participants to a small house and turned around. The desert fortress tasks them with eliminating martial arts masters, those that distort people's usual pace of life and interfere with them. Half of the subjects were dumbfounded, which means they will have to behead the enemies who prevent people from living. Timothy winced, his gaze fixed on his companion, who was enjoying the effect produced. After waiting a few seconds, the man coughed into his fist, attracting attention. He pointed to a 2-story building where the participants would live. As soon as they moved in, they would be assigned to a building corresponding to their group and given basic necessities. A week passed. Timothy sat in his bed and was surprised by this. The distribution was taking longer than expected. He closed his eyes, leaning forward slightly. It was time to meditate. But this activity was interrupted by Howard's ringing voice. He was standing behind the door. He asked if he could come in, and without waiting for an answer, he opened the door with a mischievous smile. Timothy asked why he had come as his friend walked towards his bed, his hands clasped behind his back. Howard excitedly exclaimed that he had heard rumors about the end of the distribution. He and Timothy would be in the same fighting group, Magwanig. The heir to the House of Walker thought for a moment about his future destiny. His friend, meanwhile, sat down next to him on the bed without permission and asked if Timothy had heard the rumors. Leaders of 17 fighting groups led by Philip Dawson participated in martial arts competitions to select new martial artists. In this case, it turned out that the leaders of the groups were obliged to compete with each other. Howard winked at his younger comrade, saying that many people just wanted to acquire a nickname like White Killin or Lightning Demon. The next day, the Magwanig battle training began, and the participants gathered at a large bowl. Everyone received brand new white uniforms with distinctive insignia on the shoulders. Howard lovingly looked at himself, and Timothy looked around tensely. Both found themselves in the center of attention. The other members, who had been in the group for a long time, looked at them, sometimes smiling, sometimes frowning. Among them were also mentors, who were now looking at the boys appraisingly. Standing before the boys was the stern Theodore Blair, the leader of ManhwaCapped, who was rumored to be a contender for the title of the strongest among the 17 leaders of the desert fortress. A strong and tall man with a large scar on his face came very close to Timothy. He leaned down, stared into the boy's face, and loudly pronounced his nickname. He nodded fearlessly, while Howard could barely stand on his feet from fear. Theodore narrowed his eyes, and the terrible scar that ran straight from his left eyelid became even uglier. But to his surprise, Timothy didn't look scared or embarrassed at all. This made the leader very happy. This is exactly what he expected from his people. The man chuckled contentedly. He smiled at Timothy, saying that he saw his spirit. People like him do not give up easily. The fighting force led by Philip Dawson in the Desert Fortress is similar to the cult in the Central Plains, where members will learn martial arts and carry out missions. When Howard heard that those present were elders and mentors, he raised his hand, exclaiming that he had a question. Theodore gave him permission to speak, and the boy thanked him for the opportunity. He asked what it meant to learn martial arts in the desolate fortress. Was it that everyone would learn the same martial arts? The leader shook his head, replying that this was not the case. Everyone would be trained in a unique style. Naturally, knowledge is limited only to the techniques of ManhwaCapped. The young man was pleased with this, and Theodore added that persistent training was necessary for survival. Timothy had also heard of ManhwaCapped's technique before. A friend had mentioned it to him earlier. ManhwaCapped is a fairly well-known faction among the 17 forces led by Philip Dawson. They once clashed with 24 elite masters of the Kelly sect and did not lose a single fighter. This incident only strengthened the faith of those who believe that the Desert Fortress has no equal in the world. The Desert Fortress belongs to the Lofor sect, and attacking a sect martial artist isn't considered treason, so the boys could challenge the strongest to learn. This was also necessary for improvement, but Timothy still clarified why it was not considered betrayal. Theodore was silent for a moment, looking at the boy with a stern gaze. There are too many unconventional fighters in the world of martial arts, some of whom practice demonic arts to the point of losing their memory, and some have simply mastered the mind-boggling arts, allowing them to slip past the strongest masters and escape into hidden valleys. Even if the fighters practice for a long time in the Desert Fortress, it does not give them any advantage in the eyes of the imperial family. That is why it is so important to do everything in one's power to become stronger. Otherwise, death. The leader turned sharply, nodding his head towards the guy who stood out from the rest, most likely due to his energy. He told the newcomers that if they went on a mission once and returned with a wound from Jordan Roberts' sword, they would immediately understand what the teacher was talking about. Jordan, sitting on the floor, smirked as he spoke about the Silver Dawn. Blue eyes looked mockingly at Timothy from under his thick bangs. The guy said that this technique was really scary. Timothy turned to the fighter, examining him. He himself had heard about the Silver Dawn technique. This is a world-renowned transcendental technique that only the legitimate heir of the Roberts family can master. And if we're talking about Jordan Roberts, isn't he considered one of the strongest masters among them? Did this guy really encounter this technology and survive? Jordan stood up, adjusted his hat, and with a smile suggested starting with lightning genius. The experienced warrior stretched his lips into a grin. Either he was mocking, or it was his usual manner of communication, and said that he had heard about Timothy's fast sword, which had no equal. When Lightning Sword returned the intense gaze, Jordan added that he wanted to verify the rumors for himself. Timothy suspected that he was probably facing a strong opponent, so he slowly walked around him, planning a strategy in his head. Pausing for a moment, he reached for the blade and pulled it out with a loud sound, then returned it to the sheath. The other senior participants and mentors immediately turned their gazes to the escalating skirmish. They, like their friend Timothy and the leader of ManhwaCapped, were amazed by the lightning-fast reaction of the young test subject. With just 1 second of action, he activated his energy, and the figure was illuminated by a noble blue light. Jordan, watching the newcomer, smiled even more, anticipating the fun. Now the guy, in turn, suddenly pulled out a beautiful carved sword from its sheath. He stood up straight in front of Timothy, slinging the heavy blade gracefully over his shoulders as if it weighed nothing. With his headdress on so that his blonde hair hid half his face, the warrior announced loudly that he, Jordan Roberts, was born and raised here in Fort Worth. Timothy introduced himself in response, a little more quietly but with the same dignity. The warrior grinned, his blue eyes measuring his opponent, and he mockingly called the town the newcomer came from a backwater. He swallowed the offensive words because Walker knew his own worth and that of his family. It was time to prepare for the competition. Jordan slightly changed his position, throwing the sword more comfortably. His movements were light, and it seemed like he didn't take Timothy seriously at all. Directing a careful glance at the newcomer, Jordan retorted that only in a real battle does it become clear that a warrior is capable. This can be seen in his swings. Hearing these words, Timothy raised an eyebrow, not understanding what the mentor meant. Really? Movements in the wind? He pointed his finger at Walker, saying that if he could end up here at such an age, it meant he was quite talented. Then he suddenly winked and pointed his sword at Timothy, urging him to show what he could do. Moreover, the newcomer who entered Magwanig needed to unlock the sword's potential. And to do this, moreover, in public, in the presence of other participants and the leader, there was nothing to do. Timothy agreed and changed the position of his hands, showing off his blade. The observers gasped in unison, leaning forward. This new guy had a black sword. Even Theodore Blair himself couldn't keep a straight face. Jordan remained in the same position. Timothy again pulled his hands back. The glow around him became brighter. The two opponents' gazes locked on each other, and the mentor laughed loudly. Timothy took a deep breath, trying to clear his head of unnecessary thoughts and focus. The young warrior was going to read the energy of his opponent's breath, breathing in rhythm with him. Measured inhalations and exhalations are what helped me find the starting point for action. And a few moments later, the very moment arrived when it was necessary to begin. Swift sword. That's the technique Timothy used as he rushed straight towards his opponent. He jerked the blade out of its sheath and swung it right next to Jordan, who was about to counterattack. Two swords, filled with different energies, almost collided, passing each other in the end. Walker nearly fell on his back and managed to stay on his feet, his heart pounding so loudly that it was hard to breathe. Jordan, however, looked completely unperturbed, having seized the initiative in the fight. Timothy looked at his mentor's confident smile, wondering how he had managed to retrieve the sword so quickly. That's right. The guy survived against the sword of Charles Jenkins, a true master. Timothy's opponent raised his hand with the blade up as he approached again, preparing to attack. Jordan was completely in a state of unprecedented excitement, knowing that he was not easily upset. Timothy finally decided to take the risk when a beam of fiery energy shot right past his face. The enemy was still standing in the same position when the young man bent down and slid across the floor, his shoes sliding. Jordan, without losing his grip, turned sharply, trying to touch the young man who was right behind him. A few seconds before the newcomer struck with his blade, the elder deftly counterattacked with his own. Opening his mouth with tension, the warrior increased the pressure, trying to push the alien weapon away from himself. But Timothy wasn't about to give up either. Veins appeared on his temples and sweat broke out on his face. But suddenly something happened that Walker did not expect at all. He was left alone on the battlefield. His opponent disappeared, but it was clearly a trick and he was already somewhere nearby, ready to attack. Timothy felt the alien energy gathering behind him in fiery streams. He stood still, focused, waiting for Jordan to finally appear. Biting his lip, the young man waited a few more seconds, expecting someone else's attack. And at the moment when the mentor did this, the newcomer again ducked, avoiding the blow of the blade. Now it was his turn to swing the sword, which Timothy did. The blow upwards on Jordan's head caused his hat to fall to the ground. Dodging, the elder did a graceful somersault in the air, ending up upside down. The cap, the color of his uniform, no longer hid his pointed ears, and it became clear where such strength came from. The boy, whose body was still raging with energy, sank to the floor, landing on one knee. The tiles around the opponents were broken in some places. Emotions gradually subsided. The battle was over. The spectators gathered around, confident of the elder's victory, fell silent in shock. Howard could no longer hide his shock, unable to close his mouth. Even the leader was confused. Timothy, breathing heavily, shook his hair and frowned at Jordan. As expected, his opponent, who looked surprisingly tired, was of a noble race. Walker's blade glowed blue again. The boy wanted to further test the resonance with the sword. But the ensuing silence confused the warrior, and he looked around. People were looking at him with their mouths slightly open in surprise. Even the opponent himself, who had previously acted so self-confident, also looked stunned. Timothy lowered his sword, standing awkwardly. He didn't understand such close attention. After coughing and catching his breath, he tried to find out if Jordan wanted to tell him something. His eyes grew larger, and all the mentor could say was just mumble something stupid in response. Finally, Timothy put his sword away, saying that he knew what his opponent had done. He had allowed him to make a few lunges, so let him be honest. Jordan looked up, and it was clear he was having a hard time composing himself and saying anything. The guy pulled himself together and rudely pointed his finger at Timothy, sharply asking how old he was. He frowned, not expecting such a banal question, and replied that he was 15, and what difference did it make? After all, the enemy usually doesn't care about age and only real achievements matter. Suddenly, Jordan almost fell backwards and muttered the newcomer's age in shock. Timothy didn't understand why age mattered when it was a matter of life and death, but everyone was interested in where such skill came from at 15 years old. The other participants could not believe what they heard, thinking that the heavens themselves had made a mistake. Some have been to the Dragon and Phoenix tournament and have never seen anything like it. Even if someone has been studying the path of perception since birth, it is very difficult to reach such heights. One of the elders grinned, remembering that he was considered a rare talent in his area. Timothy turned his gaze to Howard, who was shaking with inexpressible emotions, covering his mouth with his hand. Theodore, behind him, frowned more and more with each passing second, trying to comprehend what he had seen. Finally, Jordan shook his head, smiled, and sheathed his blade. Yet today, he was faced with this incredible young fighter who, at 15 years old, was able to give him a fight. A little later, the entire group was taken outside to train and divided into pairs. The elders sat on the stairs and laughed, hearing strained sounds from the side. The leader's large palm was immersed in a blue cloud of energy, turning inside. Howard stood there, nearly out of breath, while they were soullessly digging around in his energy center, making those very sounds. A second later, the torture stopped. Theodore frowned, but noticed that the boy at least had endured. He ordered him to analyze what had happened to him and learn a lesson. Howard pressed his palm to his chest, breathing heavily. While the unfortunate man was catching his breath, the leader turned his heavy gaze to the side. Not far from them, Timothy stood alone, training on his own. Seeing that the student had opened his eyes, the man asked if he had finished and understood the essence of the principles. Walker replied, "It is Yuntumo, a principle that describes freedom and liveliness in thought or action." This was the correct answer. No matter the situation, the body is always capable of movement, and the continuous, smooth flow is the true essence of Ma-guanig techniques. Next, the student was required to comprehend the secrets of the path of martial arts, which caused questioning looks from his friends. The leader thought for a moment, then smiled, saying that it is better to see something once than to hear about it 100 times. Having gathered the entire group around him, he approached a small stone statue with an opening in the middle and placed his palm there. After a few moments, the stone heated up and a flame of energy began to blaze around the mentor's palm. Suddenly, a strong wind arose and Howard screamed, afraid that the statue would shatter into many pieces. The air was breathtaking. Theodore's hair was flying behind him, but his gaze was serious and focused. He took a few deep breaths, the glow disappeared, and immediately after that the wind died down. Timothy realized that the leader was pouring all his power into the stone and continued to watch. Then Theodore's eyes widened and he jerked his hand back, causing the students to gasp. The next moment he clenched his left hand into a fist and pressed it to himself, and with his right hand he struck the stone with all his might. The impact caused an explosion, and the statue was indeed destroyed, just as Howard had imagined. The guy's mouth opened again in shock, looking at how just a couple of seconds ago the pieces of heavy rock were one whole. In absolute silence, Theodore cleaned his clothes and began to stack the pieces on top of each other. His students hummed and nodded in approval as the newcomers tried to figure out what had happened. Turning around, Theodore explained that it was the perfect moment and the optimal strike. The path of a person's martial arts draws this trajectory for him. If a fighter follows the martial arts path perfectly, he will achieve a superior strike. But he must understand when and where to strike best. It will be difficult to master this, just one look, but still, it is a skill that comes with practice, and you will have to work on it throughout your life. Timothy was amazed by these words, letting out a strangled cry. Could it really be true that all his life, it seemed to him that it could work out now? Theodore was about to go to the other students when he suddenly saw that the new guy was stretching his arms and walking towards another statue. The man looked at him in surprise, raising an eyebrow. Had he really decided to try it? Walker drew level with the intact figure and glanced at the one destroyed by the teacher. The guy thought that this path of his in martial arts was just an instinct. It turns out that, in the end, Timothy himself simply needs to follow it. Closing his eyes, he grabbed his blade with both hands, looking somewhere deep inside himself, using the sword resonance technique. And if you move slowly in your consciousness, discarding the unnecessary, everything may work out. Opening his eyes a few seconds later, the clan heir discovered that he seemed to have found himself in a parallel reality, where the stone no longer looked the same. There it seemed to consist of thin glass from which rays of light were shining. And this meant that all it took was thinking and making a few blows with the blade, and everything would work out. That's why Timothy suddenly raised his hands and didn't even take his sword out of its sheath. In this position, he threw the sword into his right hand and struck with all his might with the end of it into one of the parts of the statue. At that very moment, a crack appeared in the stone with a loud sound. It didn't take more than a few seconds for Timothy to jump back and the statue to shatter into pieces. The heavy structure collapsed to the ground, creating a cloud of dust and debris. Actually, that is the whole secret of the martial arts path, and it didn't even take a whole lifetime to comprehend it. Well, Timothy has mastered the basics of the Mangwaneg technique. Now all he has to do is practice it in real combat. The boy himself didn't even understand how much damage he had done to his teacher's pride. Deciding that the looks directed at him did not promise approval, Timothy looked down, muttering what was probably a weak first time. To use this properly, more real combat experience is needed. When life and death can be decided in an instant, ordinary training means little. But as an eerie silence hung in the air, the newcomer looked at the crowd again. However, he himself did not want to figure out what was going on, and therefore he bowed respectfully to Theodore, thanking him for the lesson. He stood there, arms folded across his chest, his eyes wide open at his unique student. While the others were rethinking their lives, the leader said in a strangled voice that he now had to think carefully about how to teach Walker. He blinked his eyelashes innocently, truly not understanding what had happened. The next day, Timothy was watching boats sailing along the canal when he heard his friend's voice, which seemed to appear out of nowhere. He said something about their elders recently encountering the Trinitario group. Howard settled down next to his comrade on the stairs. Walker asked why no one respected the laws of the desert fortress. After all, a fight outside the training grounds is grounds for punishment, so why did they fight? Howard suggested that it was a student from the gang who started the fight while drunk, saying that under Theodore's leadership in Mangwaneg, you won't learn anything. This surprised Timothy beyond words. Was it really only because of this that the fight broke out? Howard grew serious, complaining that his friend clearly didn't understand the world of martial arts. That's just how things worked in this place. One careless word can lead to conflict, and only by overcoming such trials can a person build his reputation and then travel freely. Timothy asked if any victory wasn't something to be proud of. After all, the elders are simply protecting the newcomers. The boy exclaimed that if someone had told him that, he simply wouldn't have known where to go. Timothy began to think that the group simply had a personal score to settle with Mangwaneg, and this was a good opportunity for some business. If he wanted to obtain the fruits of the world tree, which are revered by all noble families, he would have to achieve a lot, and for this he needed powerful allies. They say that brave warriors must owe their lives to become brothers, so it would be a good idea to make them your debtors in advance. Walker stood up abruptly, telling his friend he was right, earning him a puzzled look. If the elders even drew their swords for Timothy, he couldn't just leave it like that. He had to go to them. Howard also rose from the rock, seeing his comrade run resolutely towards the team. He exclaimed that Timothy had a fighting spirit and was not alien to the feelings of a true warrior. Timothy and Howard ran out to the square, where almost the entire group had gathered. The elders looked at the newcomers, surprised that they had come to training. They didn't have classes on schedule, but they still came. That's persistence. Timothy didn't answer, and walked confidently straight towards Theodore. Howard began to bow to smooth things over, and the elders didn't understand why he was making such an effort at the initial stage, when respect was more important at that time. The leader was not very happy about the arrival of the newcomers, but they stood before him and bowed. Throwing a menacing glance at his friends, the man asked if they had any problems with their training. To Howard's bewilderment, Timothy said he wanted a duel. Theodore shrugged and suggested that he choose an opponent. The elders would be happy to agree. Walker took a deep breath and blurted out in one breath that he didn't want to fight his own people. He intended to duel someone from the Trinitario group. Everyone who was busy with their own affairs and heard this were immediately stunned. Howard almost lost consciousness from such a statement. Leader Mangwaneg now didn't know what to expect from the student, so he said that there was no need to worry too much about yesterday's incident. Timothy thought he didn't care at all, but said out loud that he had long admired Trinitario's techniques and wanted to try them out for himself. Theodore was surprised by the enthusiasm, thinking to himself that he liked such zeal, and that the newcomer shared the feelings of his elders. Timothy bowed, exclaiming that he wanted to fight the renowned swordsman using Mangwaneg's true form, and asked the master for permission to do so. Theodore looked at the student in bewilderment for a while, wondering what he really needed. He hoped to gain experience and try out other techniques, and also gain the trust of his elders, a triple benefit. The mentor warned the newcomer that he had never seen Trinitario's combat techniques or fought alongside them. A duel would not be a problem, but the group members would not show mercy. A real fire lit up Walker's eyes. He clenched his fist and exclaimed that this was exactly what he needed. Seeing this, the elders fell silent for a moment, looking at the newcomer in shock. The next moment, they began to rejoice, shouting that this was the spirit of the true leader of the desolate fortress. They were eager to see the warrior in the future. Leader Mangwaneg covered his face with his hand as he listened to this, but then allowed Timothy to try. He also promised the boy that he would convey his request to the head of Trinitario. After some time, a demonstration fight with the opposing group took place in a special room. Everyone was surprised that the white one was challenging the blue one to a duel. But to be precise, it was just a training sparring. Howard overheard the elders placing bets on how long Timothy would last. Most, especially the Trinitario members, were betting on 10 seconds as the maximum time. Opposite 15-year-old Walker stood a tall man from the Trinitario group. It was incomprehensible that some boy would seriously want to fight him. The leader of the Trinitario group, Elijah Barnes, was a menacing-looking man with a thick beard and dark hair tied into a high ponytail. Theodore, looking at his student, increasingly doubted his decision to allow sparring. Both leaders of the group stood next to each other, but did not want to exchange a word. After a few seconds, Elijah frowned even more and raised his finger, pointing at Timothy. He was willing to bet on one of the spiritual pills if the newbie could last 10 seconds. Leader Mangwaneg was surprised that his opponent had chosen such a big bet. Elijah's eyes widened in a menacing way, and he asked defiantly if Theodore thought he would lose, and he became frightened. But Theodore demanded not to tease him, because spiritual pills were not a trifle. The leader of Trinitario hissed that the honor of their groups was at stake. Would he really joke about such things? When Theodore rolled his eyes and accepted the bet, Elijah nodded and sat down in the carved chair. He cracked his knuckles and said with a smile that a leader must believe in his subordinates. But the man didn't see the main thing, how his opponent's lips stretched into a satisfied grin. Meanwhile, it was time to begin sparring, and a member of the Trinitario group approached the white one of Mangwaneg, asking for his name, which Timothy had given earlier. The guy bowed respectfully, repeating what he had said, as etiquette required. In front of him stood a strong warrior in blue clothes. Everyone starts with white, but if you advance in your craft, you can get blue. Time is of no importance here. Sometimes it takes more than 10 years to transition from white to blue. But even the greatest masters of the major sects respect the blue warriors of the desolate fortress. The partner said that he has been training the Trinitario sword for 20 years. They say that the sword has no eyes, but the sword of a true master definitely has eyes, so he will not hold back in this sparring. Having decided to intimidate the newcomer with these words, the man was surprised when he simply nodded. However, there was no time to think, so the experienced warrior pulled out his blade in one jerk. The noble steel in the hands of its owner immediately lit up with a bright light. The warrior immediately demonstrated his skill, the energy in his body seething, illuminating everything around him. The overseeing group leaders held their breath, while Timothy tried to abstract himself from everything and concentrate on the sparring. He was curious about what kind of sword mystery the blue warriors of Trinitario used. The boy grabbed the carved hilt of his blade, ordering himself to cast aside unnecessary thoughts. The steel of the sword also shone with light, no matter what the enemy could do, because Walker was here to reveal his skills. His opponent growled, holding his weapon in front of him, that he would give the newcomer the first turn. Timothy didn't wait long and used his time play skill. He took off like lightning and ran forward, ending up right in front of the blue one. The boy's sword, charged with energy, collided with the other's blade with a loud bang. The experienced warrior did not expect at all that the puny young fighter would be able to fight him back in the very first second. Having received a barely noticeable blow, the man was amazed at such a quick reaction. The next moment, Timothy, who was determined to recognize the alien technique, leaned forward again. The fighter from Trinitario barely had time to defend and counterattack. He could not catch up with the boy's pace. The man continued to walk back while Timothy advanced, moving faster and faster with each passing moment. The leader of Mangwaneg was pleased with the student, but Elijah next to him did not believe that the white fighter had such speed. Hearing these words, Theodore couldn't help but grin triumphantly. After all, you don't hear something like that every day. Looking at the skills of this young man, you can even forget how to breathe. He was so fast. But with Timothy's experience, the only option for victory is to seize the initiative now. Seizing the moment, Walker turned around and walked backwards towards his opponent, hitting him in the chest with his shoulder. He hesitated and tried to dodge, but Timothy turned to face him again and moved forward with his sword. The man let out a strangled groan, sweat pouring into his eyes, and he tried with all his might to hold back the other man's onslaught. The play of time accelerated the mind. Timothy smiled faintly. He had grown a lot since he came here. The principles of martial arts accumulate in the body, tempered by the art of movement of his clan. The more curved the trajectory of the sword, the more the back muscles are involved. If you use rotation, the energy forms a vortex that prevents the enemy from even seeing you. The spectators were stunned by such a reception. The strong wind almost blew them off their feet. Timothy, meanwhile, circled around the experienced fighter, not allowing him to make a single attack. No matter how hard he tried, he could not resist. The young man realized that he seemed to have mastered another technique. A grin, foreshadowing a decline in strength, appeared on the blue one's face. He still tried to at least not fall flat on his face. In the end, less than the agreed-upon 10 seconds had passed before the senior warrior's weapon flew out of his hands. It all happened in a matter of moments. The sound of thrown iron echoed through the room. Timothy breathed heavily, looking at his opponent with a frown, pressing the tip of his blade to his neck. He didn't even move and seemed to be trying not to breathe. He just raised his hands, nervously scratching his wrist. Theodore couldn't help but chuckle through his wide grin as Elijah bolted upright, gripping the armrests tightly. Even the senior advisors were beside themselves with what they saw, muttering something under their breath. There was thunderous applause and shouts as Timothy looked at his sword. He had indeed won. Having removed the weapon from the stranger's neck, he lowered his eyes and hid it in its sheath. He was lucky. The guy believed that he won because of a flash of inspiration that added strength to his impulse at the right moment. If they were asked to fight again now, things might turn out differently. Timothy bowed to his opponent, thanking him for the opportunity to enjoy his amazing swordsmanship up close. The fight had been glorious. The man smiled and turned around to finally pick up his blade from the floor. He slung the weapon over his shoulder, briefly remarking that Timothy's skill was beyond his age. The young man was surprisingly gifted in fencing. Having gone to his group, the warrior repeated the white man's name to himself once again, repeating that he was so young, but his strength was incomprehensible. The spectators were openly envious of Magwanig's possession of the treasure. The group leader closed his eyes and extended his hand to the leader of Trinitario, who was furious at losing. Timothy took a deep breath and closed his eyes, giving himself a break. He decided that he would call this new technique the Incomprehensible Dawn. The boy heard the leader's voice calling his name and opened his eyes. A man with a satisfied smile was walking straight towards him. Without commenting on what was happening, he threw an elegant dark-colored box with beautifully depicted trees into the student's hands. Timothy was incredibly surprised when he caught the thing and carefully opened the lid. On a soft red pillow lay it, the spiritual pill of Trinitario. The young man looked questioningly at leader Magwanig, who informed him that the pill rightfully belonged to Walker. Even the next day, when everyone returned to the Magwanig territory, the talk about Timothy, the monster guy, did not subside. Christine Palmer, nicknamed Sharp Sword, the eldest in blue robes, thought that defeating such an experienced swordsman as the blue-winged Joe from Trinitario was something special. The guy is not only talented and hardworking, but also modest and polite, and also has a unique ability to grasp martial arts techniques on the fly. Looking into the distance, Jordan agreed with his friend. He, too, had never seen such potential. Christine recalled what happened when she used the technique in sparring with someone else in Timothy's presence. This guy easily recreates the same moves in a more refined form. And he does it with incredible ease. It seems like he doesn't strain himself at all. It's even somehow awkward to use mediocre techniques in front of him. There's some innate ability to grasp the very essence of techniques. Jordan finished Christine's thought by adding that Timothy seemed to have always known these techniques. While they were discussing the boy, he was in the head's office, sitting on a mat in the lotus position, listening to the words of the mentor. Theodore walked slowly around the student, telling him about the pill. He did not know how much of it he would be able to absorb. Typically, it is around 60 to 70%, but depending on the circumstances, it may be less. And even if the spiritual pill doesn't live up to Timothy's expectations, there's no need to put pressure on yourself. There is a danger of damaging your energy core or meridians if you are not careful. The key to absorbing the pill is to allow its energy to circulate with the qi until it is completely dissolved. If the flow of qi becomes unstable, the master will intervene, so one must remain calm. The young fighter agreed with everything that was told to him and slowly chewed the pill, then swallowed it. Everything inside seemed to shake. The energy of the pill began to spread throughout the body. The gold film that covered the tablet burned like fire. Timothy sat motionless, imagining a hot fire spreading in his chest. The pill's power combined with Walker's, resulting in a small hurricane that swept across the room and knocked the box over. Theodore had never seen anything like it. And now, holding his breath, he watched the golden rays of light that burst out of the student's body. The irrepressible energy threatened to destroy everything in its path, and only Timothy knew whether this venture would end in success. Even Christine and Jordan, sitting outside, sensed that something unusual was happening. Turning around, they stopped their gaze on the side of the building where the white man and their teacher were now located. It seemed that it had already begun. I wonder how strong their youngest will become after consuming the energy pill. By evening, The fire that had blossomed in Timothy's chest slowly spread to the rest of his body. The guy stubbornly refused to wake up, but to accept the full potential within himself, large drops of sweat running down his face. Bright flashes were visible on the mentor's frowning and worried face. This was Timothy's first experience of absorption, but his flow of chi did not waver, and there was no need to even interfere. A few minutes later, the newcomer opened his eyes and looked in confusion at his hands, from which golden flashes emanated. Theodore forced a smile and congratulated the boy on having fully absorbed the pill's energy. Timothy brought the brush closer to his face with unprecedented interest, feeling how his chi noticeably strengthened. The leader of the group could not fully believe that this boy was able to absorb all the energy himself, without any help. Timothy's eyes widened, realizing that with the increase in internal energy, he could sense things he hadn't even noticed before. With some unimaginable feeling, he realized that his elders were all around the perimeter of the area. The boy asked the mentor if everyone was guarding him while he was swallowing the pill. When there was no answer, Walker stood up and seriously asked the teacher why everyone was so kind to him. Theodore turned around, and to Timothy's surprise, the stern expression on his face changed to a smile. It's not specifically about the newcomer. It's just natural for a group to take care of its members. In the world of martial arts, where life and death are often at stake, solidarity is natural. The higher the student's combat skills, the better it is for the Magwanig faction. That's the whole secret and the answer to Timothy's question. He remained silent, deep in thought. Late in the evening, sitting in the lotus position on the bed in his room, the guy concentrated on his internal sensations. The energy had increased and was now incomparable with the previous chi. Now the student wanted to test in the training hall how much stronger he had become. He got dressed and went out into the darkness of the night. As he passed the square, a girl's voice called out to him. Turning around, Timothy saw Truesward in front of him, calling to him, waving her hand. The girl asked if the newcomer had come here to train. Unable to resist, he scratched the back of his head and nodded. Christine admitted that she also got inspired to train while watching the guy fight. And only now Timothy realized that Christine had been promoted. He congratulated the older one. She thanked him but did not focus on it, replying that this was only a small step forward. She apologized to Timothy in case he decided to train alone, then offered to spar. He bowed, saying that solo training could be done at any time, but learning from the senior sharpsword was a rare opportunity. The girl bowed in response and with a smile asked to call her simply Christine. Timothy looked down and nodded, agreeing. If that would be enough. White and blue went to different sides of the square, choosing comfortable positions. Timothy immediately drew his blade from its sheath, announcing that he would go first. Christine didn't object. She didn't have a weapon with her. She got into a fighting stance and waved her hand to call for them to begin. The newcomer didn't wait long. He immediately ran towards the girl with a sword in front of him. And although he was very fast, he had barely approached Christine when she grabbed the hilt of his sword with her left hand. Letting go for a second, she grabbed Timothy by the wrist and created a cloud of purple energy with her right hand. This palm immediately rushed towards the guy's stomach, and the cloud began to spread across his clothes. Intently reading her opponent's every move, Christine intensified her attack, and now the purple flame passed through the newcomer's body. And even though it was a training fight, Timothy tensed up, gritting his teeth, trying to stay on his feet. Christine removed her hand, and the student managed to break the bonds of the alien energy by moving back. Taking a deep breath, Sharpsword clenched her fist again and went on the offensive. Timothy, as before, copied someone else's technique. A blue flame ignited in his hand, purple and blue colors collided in a small flash, each trying to strengthen the flow. Christine pushed forward with one hand. The new guy had to push forward with both hands. He felt dark currents wrapping around his body. It was not so easy to cope with the elder one. His energy drained, the guy had to dodge to avoid being captured. He was breathing heavily, clutching the blade in one hand and pressing the other to himself. The girl squeezed her palm and looked approvingly at the newcomer, noting his abilities. Timothy asked in surprise if Christine practiced the power flow technique. This was indeed the case. As a swordsman who studies Storm cannot rely solely on his sword, close combat techniques such as force flow are extremely effective. Even if the enemy knows how to strengthen the body with chi, it allows one to destroy this defense. But the effectiveness of the power flow depends on the ability to correctly invest internal energy into the strike. Timothy listened attentively to the elder and asked if he could share his observations of the newcomer. Walker began cautiously by saying that he had been quite sensitive to chi since childhood. He then drew a surprised look from Christine when he said bluntly that he had noticed a slight problem with the girl's control. There was a silence, and Christine asked if the guy was able to see the movement of chi, but it turned out that this was not entirely true. Timothy did not see the flow of chi inside the body, but only observed the flow when it came out along with the person's energy. Christine thought, tapping her finger on her chin. It was hard to even believe it. After all, such a sense of perception is given only to purple-ranked masters. The top of the martial arts mastery hierarchy in the Desert Fortress is, first comes white, then blue, then black, and only then purple. Closing her eyes, Christine sighed and decided to listen to the newcomer to take his observations into account. Then he said that if you look closely at the girl's palm technique, it seems to him that it is more suitable for inserting chi than any other technique. Walker looked closely at his palm, wondering how best to explain it. The very nature of Christine's internal energy seems more suitable for close combat techniques. Just as Timothy was saying that if he put more chi into this technique, it would become much more powerful, Christine interrupted him, calling him Junior with a noticeable disdain in her voice. Frowning, the girl asked if the newcomer thought he was some kind of idiot who didn't know how to distribute her internal energy and didn't put in enough ki. There was a moment of awkward silence and Walker looked embarrassed. He lowered his eyes and asked for forgiveness for saying too much and upsetting the elder. But she suddenly simply waved her hand and turned around, saying that it was she who should apologize. Christine walked away towards the head's office, and Timothy watched her for a long time. Blue told Theodore that the new guy seemed to have unlocked her fighting skills. She even asked if the leader had mentioned anything about the origin of her skills in the presence of the white man. The mentor snorted, calling these words nonsense because he could not tell something so important. Christine thought, tapping her finger on her chin again, about how the guy found out about everything. Theodore guessed that the newcomer had discovered the techniques that the group was developing from the lost divine demon art, and that was probably the answer. Rising from the table, Theodore said that Timothy was a special guy. Even if you went around the world, it would be difficult to find such talent. Such a person appears only once in a generation. Even those whose skill is undeniable will confirm this. Christine frowned and folded her arms across her chest, looking seriously at the head. The girl then asked if Theodore thought the guy was really at that level. He was firm in his guess. Timothy was undoubtedly the future elite in the hierarchy. It doesn't matter what others think of him, but you definitely shouldn't dismiss his words as the advice of a newbie. Christine timidly asked if she should discuss the divine demon art with the white man. The head nodded, because teaching the eldest had its limits. He had little time, and in such circumstances, advice was very appropriate. Timothy is already showing the qualities of a great master in the near future. Moreover, this guy adapts all the techniques he studies to suit himself. However, these words hurt Christine's pride and she tried to be indignant. Theodore continued calmly, picking up the scroll, that the only problem lies in Timothy's character. And just then a small task came in. The leader tapped his shoulder with the scroll, asking the elder to observe how the newcomer copes with the circumstances of life and death along with his comrades. The man then handed the scroll to the student, saying that this was how they would know if Timothy was trustworthy. Looking at how the new guy handled his blade, they bet on him for 5 years. The higher-ups in the group unanimously declared that the boy would certainly lead Magwaneg in 5 years. The sound of the horses' hooves and their force raised clouds of dust into the air, drenching the riders. Jordan, Christine, Timothy, and Howard. The only girl in the company did not lag behind her brothers, because she was ordered to personally look into the inside of her future leader. Several days passed and a group of senior and junior students arrived at the Cambridge County Post Office. The stable boy kindly led the horses into their stalls, while Howard leaned against his own and rubbed his back. He had barely survived 10 days on horseback. Timothy glanced first at his friend, who had begun to warm up, then glanced at the unperturbed Jordan. A little later, the chief gathered everyone to tell them that someone from the Blood Flame was terrorizing the village, regularly killing livestock and destroying crops. This was happening in the Cambridge district. There are groups that could deal with this themselves, but recently there was an incident with the theft of the Amherst sex elixirs. Howard exclaimed that the stolen pills were the life-giving elixir, supposedly comparable to the Great Berkeley Revival. The chief wasn't sure exactly, but it seemed the scale of this mission required the mobilization of the entire Nebraska fighting community, and they were short on resources. Theodore looked seriously at the students, saying that this was why they had asked for their help. He also added that it would be the 4 students, seniors, and juniors who would be in charge of this. Timothy was familiar with the Bloodfire clan firsthand, but he did not tell his brothers anything about his past. When the group went outside, the boy heard disgruntled voices. The men were saying that the request had been sent a long time ago, but help had only arrived now. It was a local official, fat and pompous. He said loudly that he had always respected the Desert Fortress as the sword of the Empire, but now he saw a frivolous attitude. Walker became curious as to why they, as representatives of the fortress, were spoken of in such a way. The official walked slowly towards the company, his servant holding a brightly burning lantern. His companion, looking at the guests, grimaced and said that only suckers had arrived. He chuckled in displeasure, because he was sure that they would not be able to cope with the offender. Timothy turned around and just as loudly asked the leader what these people wanted from them. Jordan, without even hiding, called the local officials ignorant, because in such a remote place they had probably never seen a real master of martial arts. That's why some people equate swordsmen in the service of the empire with their personal cleaners. These words provoked the anger of the fat official. He ran up to Jordan, complaining about his unheard-of insolence, and Timothy asked if his speech acupuncture point needed to be sealed. The elder nodded, because less talk, more action. But when the man almost touched Christine, the newcomer standing behind him made the words come true. Without warning, he sealed the dot with 2 fingers. The official's face lengthened and his eyes became several times larger. Looking the insolent man straight in the face, Timothy clearly stated that the fighter's indignation did not bother him much. The servant, who was the man's companion, began to calm him down, and the 4 students calmly walked away. Walking along a forest path, Howard caught up with his friend, asking if he had already mastered acupuncture techniques. Having heard an affirmative answer, the guy was taken aback. Even addressing his friend as "you" seemed somehow disrespectful. He exclaimed that from now on he would call his friend Young Master Walker. Timothy replied with a smile that he didn't mind hearing it from the lips of the divine guardian of the desert fortress. Howard straightened his shoulders proudly. What a pleasure it was to hear such high praise. Timothy walked on, silently thinking, when suddenly he felt someone else's touch on his shoulder. It was Jordan, and he put his arm around the newcomer and explained the unspoken law of non-interference. That is, the government and the martial arts world do not interfere in each other's affairs. But the fighters in the gangs, unlike others, can afford to be a little more hands-on with officials. And since they act on behalf of the ruling family, it's a pleasure to put fools in their place, especially those who think they can raise warriors. Such is the privilege of a fighter of the desert fortress. Christine approached the guys, rightly reminding the new guy that it's better not to overdo it. She chuckled, saying that it was great, because the official couldn't utter a word no matter how hard he tried. Through the laughter, Howard heard some noise and called the others over to check it out too. Something strange was happening in the village nearby. It was too noisy and crowded for this time of day. The fighters looked closer and, to their horror, noticed several figures with fiery red hair. A huge oaf from the Bloodflame clan threatened the locals with a rusty sword, and in his other hand he held a crying baby by the clothes. The villagers tried in vain to deal with the bastard, who shook the child, ordering him to shut up. Seeing all this, Timothy's whole being was filled with incredible rage. He immediately activated the energy and rushed forward without saying anything to his comrades. It was a matter of honor to kill the oaf. Out of the corner of his eye he saw a flash of gold, and turning his head to the right, Timothy saw Jordan overtaking him. This was the Roberts clan's technique of movement. Super speed. Superhuman movement faster than light. Meanwhile, on the other side, Timothy was already overtaking Christine, who was also rushing to help. But how surprised Walker was when Howard also ran past him. The newcomer frowned, realizing that this was where one of his weaknesses had surfaced. He even cursed as he watched the other fighters become barely noticeable dots in the distance. All this time, the guy didn't really train in movement techniques. There was little time for that in the training room. Meanwhile, the villager's nightmare continued. The sect scoundrel swung his sword, and blood sprayed into the air. Fortunately, he only wounded a man, to whom other residents immediately ran to help. While the men and women of the village, armed only with sticks, tried to drive away the sectarian, he paid no attention to them, continuing to cry at the baby, who was irritating him with his crying. It was at this moment that Jordan approached the scene, drew his blade with a jerk, and pounced on his opponent. He ran towards the giant with all his might. Then the warrior went around him and ran on. Fiery energy passed through the monster, and the blades collided, producing a loud ringing sound. Deciding that he had gotten off with only a weak blow, the cultist growled, raising his sword. And only the next second he looked in amazement at the one who attacked him, seeing a baby in someone else's arms. The blue fighter of the desert fortress. This puzzled the monster, and the impudent fellow even stole the prey from under its nose. At that moment, Christine ran from the other side towards the sectarian. Having decided he had enough, the man roared, turning the air around him into an avalanche of fire. Jordan stepped back, shielding the child from the fire, while Christine jerked her blade out. The cultist roared once more and decided to save himself by running away, flying into the air, leaving a beam of fire behind him. Finding himself high up, he, completely engulfed in energy, rushed higher, running away. Both fighters looked up in confusion. They had never seen anything like this before, and although the danger had passed for now, They did not know what kind of one it was. Christine assessed the speed. Judging by it, the bastard was spending life force to use such a movement technique, as expected from the Blood Flame sect. Turning around, the girl saw Howard and Timothy, who had just now run to the settlement. The first one was barely breathing, running closer. He bent over the ground, trying to even out his breathing. Later, when the four returned to their shelter, Christina called Howard to her. She reported that his overall combat skills were in line with his white level, but his endurance was lacking, and he needed to work on that from now on. Exhausted from the long run, the newcomer bowed with some difficulty, promising to train. When the elder turned to Timothy, he hung his head in disappointment and felt uneasy. The guy's fundamental skills are surprisingly well developed, a level of mastery rarely seen even among the 8 clans. Seeing how Timothy moves without using techniques, no one in the Manhwa group will be able to catch up with him. She joked that even the puny Jordan chuckled and said that no one cares about other people's speed. The elder blue's keen gaze did not miss how upset Timothy was. He felt like a loser who not only came last, but also almost let down his elders. Jordan stood up, walked over to the spreading tree that grew in the yard and addressed the newcomer. He leaned his left hand on the tree trunk, suddenly offering the boy to teach him his technique of movement. Timothy's dull gaze immediately filled with life. He looked at his brother with hope. As if he had instantly forgotten his failure, Timothy approached the elder with interest. He replied that the technique of movement was not considered a full-fledged martial art of the clan. Just a short lesson in walking, which was too difficult for most ordinary people. But a newcomer could manage it. Walker couldn't quite believe his ears. He was being offered to learn the Roberts clan's movement technique. Jordan winked at Timothy, telling him not to get too excited, as no one in the Manhwa sect had ever gotten the hang of it. Christine rolled her eyes when the guy added that he had once taught to those who wanted to learn, but no one had succeeded. The ground beneath Jordan's feet lit up with a golden light, as if hundreds of golden fireflies were rising up. To the amazed gaze of the newcomers, the Superman rose slightly upward, the hem of his cloak fluttering in the wind. Although it is called a movement technique, there is no system in it. Timothy noticed that energy appeared at the tips of his fingers, although there was no activation of the flow. Jordan looked around at the onlookers and repeated that it was just a walking lesson. The warrior folded his hands behind his back and walked easily along the tree trunk, as if it were an ordinary floor. The smile disappeared from Jordan's face. He was extremely focused as he walked along the tree. Having climbed onto one of the wide branches, he also continued to run along it without difficulty. The boy stopped and leaned one hand against a tree, admiring the view. Timothy didn't even feel the warrior's presence. He watched him carefully, reading every movement, absorbing knowledge. This Roberts clan technique does not use chi, but something like energy supports the body. Finally, Jordan took a step in the air, finishing the demonstration drill. He ran down the trunk to the others without losing his balance at all. Timothy noted that even the warrior's descent was like a falling leaf. Finding himself in front of the newcomer, the elder smiled at him, asking if he understood. Rubbing his chin, Timothy replied that it was most likely some kind of wind created with energy, but it didn't have the same powers as the Roberts clan. Jordan was taken aback. The smile instantly wiped off his face. He asked if the guy understood it, just watching the flow of energy. After thinking a little more, Timothy looked at the blue one, wondering if this wasn't why they showed him the technique. A few seconds passed in stunned silence. The guy finally spoke. He realized something thanks to Jordan. He began to talk about how he had broken down the movements based on fighting forms and allocated energy accordingly. Timothy was interrupted by Howard, who turned wearily and muttered that this would take a long time, and that he would better go and find a place to spend the night. Night fell and everyone gradually fell asleep. But Timothy could not calm down, remembering Jordan and how he demonstrated the technique using the energy of nature. Even in a calm state, the guy was burning with unreleased energy. He wanted to repeat what he saw. That warm night, Jordan chose to sleep on a lounger tied directly to that very tree. Through his sleep, the elder heard the door creak. Opening his eyes, he looked down. Timothy came out of the room, trying not to make noise. He walked quietly across the yard. Without revealing himself, Jordan watched the guy in surprise, not guessing why he came out. Timothy crossed the square and stopped nearby, opposite the gate to the inn. Taking a deep breath and concentrating, the guy lowered his head, looking at his feet. He copied what he saw Jordan do, his feet glowing blue. Roberts himself, lying in the hammock, almost flew out of there when he saw what the new guy was doing. He called the guy crazy when he imitated his pose and easily rose into the air. As the days went by, Howard trained diligently with the sword, while Christine watched him. The guy still couldn't believe that they had been here for about a month, and Timothy had already mastered the art of the Roberts clan. Lying in the hammock, Jordan rocked harder. He didn't deny that the newcomer had the makings of a great master. Even for his clan, this was not the easiest task. Listening to the guy's conversation, Christine remembered the words of the leader, who once suggested that she herself look into the inside of the future leader. Howard stopped and asked worriedly if it was a good idea to send Timothy alone. The elder shook her head, reminding them that the people were too scared to leave them. Besides, this is a reconnaissance mission. Timothy can easily handle it himself. No need to worry. Holding the hilt of his trusty sword, the newcomer ran alone through the thick forest. He was patrolling and training at the same time, and this lightness, speed, and distribution of forces were incomparable with the previous ones. It was so nice to feel completely different. The newbie didn't even realize that for someone such results were worth years of training. Suddenly, among the dense trees and bushes, a space under the mountain and a familiar red color flashed. Timothy cleared a path for himself and looked closer, cautiously approaching. He had finally discovered the lair of the Blood Tribe sect, and it was time to go back and tell everyone. But suddenly something happened that knocked all thoughts of leaving from the boy's head. The crunch of human bones was heard. The ugly sectarian bit the neck of the unconscious boy with his teeth. The fighter's eyes widened in horror and disgust at the terrible picture. The cannibal grabbed the child's body with his hands, preparing like an otherworldly creature to drink his blood. Forgetting about caution, Walker took a step, unsuccessfully stepping on a branch. The cultist heard this and immediately became wary. Realizing that he could no longer hide, or even more so escape, Timothy went out into the clearing. The sectarian immediately placed the boy's body aside and knelt down, grabbing the sword that was lying to the side. Looking closer, he saw white clothes and the symbol of the desert fortress, immediately understanding where the stranger came from. Laughing vilely, the human monster wiped the blood from his lips with the back of his hand, smearing it even more. Having risen, the sectarian began to slowly approach Timothy, asking if he was alone. Convinced of this, the red-haired man bared his sharp teeth, calling the fighter a fool who actually dared to come here alone. With a roar, the cultist drew his blade and rushed straight at the guy, screaming that he should blame himself for what happened. But Timothy's spirit was fueled by rage and hatred for these people, and therefore his sword turned out to be more agile than someone else's. The heavy body from which the head had instantly separated fell heavily to the ground. With one cultist down in less than a minute, Walker turned his head to where the unconscious child lay. The small, motionless body immediately brought to mind a heartbreaking scene from Timothy's past. The sword was instantly filled with the energy of its owner, and the thirst for revenge boiled in the mind of the newcomer. Looking at the small dwelling under the mountain, he swore that he would not leave these bastards alone. Energy illuminated everything around. Emanating in waves from the warrior, Timothy called on the child to wait for him. After the massacre, he would bury the boy with dignity. Timothy decided to use the same technique his mentor taught him when training with the statue. The mind immediately drew a diagram of the house, in which it was divided into parts and destroyed. There was a bright flash in the air, and the student immediately imagined the building collapsing. Timothy's swift sword storm technique allowed him to destroy an already fragile house with just one swing of his weapon. The sectarians there were instantly knocked off their feet by the blast wave. At first they thought it was an earthquake. The cannibals screamed, trying to get to their feet, but it was all in vain. One of them trembled when he saw a vague silhouette through the destroyed thin walls. Timothy immediately broke through the hanging fabric and ran with his sword in front of him towards the monsters. Anyone standing too close was immediately pierced by a combat weapon. The second surviving cultist had nothing on him, and therefore could only simply back away from the sword. A sharp blade immediately pierced his chest. Timothy screamed that the Blood Flame cult lives by the principle of survival of the fittest. Leaning over the fallen monster, the boy hissed that being killed by a stronger one was natural for them. The newcomer jerked his sword out and kicked away the heavy body like trash. Looking back, he saw a long, deep tunnel in the wall of the cave, from which a dim red light was coming. Timothy realized that even more energy was coming from the cave, and that this was where the root of evil lay. So this wasn't just a hideout for members of the Blood Flame cult. It was a cult base. Timothy came closer, and the creatures, sensing the death of their brethren, ran out. Someone dared to attack them. It was reckless. A crowd of red-haired, strong men ran straight at the guy with blades at the ready, wanting him to pay with blood for what he had done. Walker pursed his lips and prepared for battle, knowing that no one would help him. The red-haired gang growled menacingly, continuing to threaten the man who had wandered in. It seemed they didn't even expect him to gather all his energy and rush straight into the crowd. Timothy raised his sword and, combining several techniques, soared up to the ceiling of the cave. He described a circle of energy with his blade around several cultists at once, encircling them in this way. They watched in confusion as thin threads of light burned through their bodies. The next moment, streams of blood rose into the air as the threads of light turned into real deep cuts. Timothy watched as the cultists died, not paying attention to how their blood sprinkled him from head to toe. An entire group of monsters was defeated, but the bloody glow from the depths of the cave did not disappear. The alien energy of death intensified. A loud, muffled voice asked the puppy from the desert fortress what he had done here. Timothy didn't take a step back. Rising to his feet, he peered into the distance. Through the red haze and the wind, the silhouette of a tall man with a sword appeared. And only now did Walker realize that the ominous energy did not come from a group of cultists. A few seconds later, a man who looked like a savage came out to the student. He was dressed in rags, and his black and red hair fell on his shoulders. Red streams enveloped Timothy, but the thirst for revenge was stronger than any fear. The stranger's eyes glowed in the semi-darkness, and he was completely different from those Walker had encountered before. Finally, when the man came into the light, his terrible facial features became visible. The newbie heard that when a person reaches a certain level of internal energy, their hair color can visually change. In that case, it could only be the leader of this cult, the Supreme Master. In the Blood Flame sect, he is called the Blood Demon with a sword. With a creepy grin, the monster pulled a strong blade from its sheath and hissed that the boy's suffering would help quench his thirst for blood. Timothy swallowed hard, the saliva that had accumulated in his mouth, continuing to watch the cultist with the title that the leaders of the Blood Flame sect's divisions bear. Among the civilian population and the lower classes of the martial world, they are considered to be reapers of death. There are very few masters skilled enough to kill them. This was the kind of monster that now appeared before Timothy. They were about to fight to the death. The ugly face twisted into a terrible grimace, but the student only gripped his sword tighter, filling it with energy. He knew he had to attack first before the blood demon got close, just like he had gotten the upper hand last time, attacking the Trinitario member before he could react. So now it was necessary to act in the same way, and Timothy raised his sword in front of the sectarian. He grinned, baring his fangs, growling that everyone in the desert fortress was so arrogant. Walker, beside himself with anger, used the time play technique, running up to his opponent. He held the sword out in front of him as the boy made several swings, leaving a blue light in the air. The blood demon nearly fell on his back when the sharp blade appeared right above his face. The warrior managed to land the first blow. While the cultist was coming to his senses, barely able to stand on his feet, Timothy again ran at him even more furiously. He moved with such incredible speed that the leader of the Blood Flame felt like he was being attacked by several opponents at once. Having come to his senses, he bared his teeth terribly, defending himself with a blade and advancing on the guy. The ugly mouth twisted into a grimace of a smile, mockingly hissing that the fighter's techniques were impressive. These words made Timothy incredibly angry. He frowned and lashed out with another blow. The mind threw up painful memories. At that moment, the boy could not boast that he knew how to protect his family. Walker's teeth clicked together in anger, realizing that the decisive moment had arrived. He gathered all the pain and rage that had haunted him for a long time and dealt a crushing blow. Timothy is no longer who he was before. Walker approached the bewildered blood demon and grabbed him by the wrist of the hand with which the cultist held the sword. By slightly turning the skin towards himself, Timothy thus simply tore the veins in the human body alive. The cult leader screamed terribly, cursing at the top of his lungs, and made to grab the offender with his good hand. But the fighter didn't pay attention to the insults. He was going to finish off the bastard. Timothy shifted slightly to the side and made another swing with his sword, cutting off the second hand. Looking at the bloody stumps, the sectarian roared, not understanding himself from pain and horror. Walker gritted his teeth and prepared to deliver the final blow with his blade. Taking advantage of the enemy's hesitation, he ran at him and plunged his sword straight into his heart. The once greatest sect master slowly sank to the floor, his killer remaining on his feet without drawing his sword. The blood demon's eyes widened and he coughed up blood, lowering his head. Timothy, holding the sword hilt tightly, turned the weapon a few more times. The remnants of life slowly smoldered in the body of the defeated enemy. He could not believe that he had fallen at the hands of someone like this boy. He looked into the eyes of the sectarian, whispering that he had probably only caused pain before, but had never experienced it himself. It was all over, and the young warrior jerked his sword out, pushing the monster away from him. He rose to his feet, looked once more at the bloody demon and breathed a deep sigh of relief. The bodies of the sectarians lay scattered all over the field, and their leader stood prostrate on his knees, dead. Timothy sheathed his sword and then noticed a deep hole nearby. As he approached the edge, the young man's heart sank. At the bottom lay numerous dead villagers, including many children. The sun was gradually sinking below the horizon, and Walker headed back. Before leaving, he wished that peach blossoms would cover the peace of these unfortunate people. Timothy returned to the inn after dark, and the soldiers greeted him with cries of shock. Howard was shocked by his friend's appearance. Jordan looked at the newcomer with a frown and concern. He was covered in blood and dirt, holding an unconscious child on his back. Everyone immediately got up from the table. Howard screamed in horror again, not knowing how to approach Timothy. He handed the baby to his friend, asking him to look at him. Howard began to examine the child, hoping that he was not dead. Christine realized that the student had been fighting. She asked what happened and if he was okay. Walker seemed to only now realize that he was covered in dirt and began to examine himself. He replied that he was fine, and the blood was not his. The guy found the place where the division of the Blood Flame sect had settled. The older one sighed with relief, saying that it was good, but then a few seconds later she jumped up. She leaned her hands on the table, exclaiming that she had not immediately realized that the newcomer had found the sect's abode. Timothy spoke of 8 members of the Blood Flame sect, all of whom were causing trouble in the village, and there was also a strong man with black and red hair. Hearing this, everyone fell silent. Christine stared at the newcomer in confusion. She walked around the table, immediately realizing that he meant the blood demon with the sword. It turns out that this is definitely one of the factions of the Blood Flame sect. Jordan, without saying anything, picked up his blade from the table, attached it to his belt and stood up. Whatever the goals of the cults that have settled nearby, the Blood Flame are an enemy of the desert fortress, and the warriors are obliged to eradicate this threat. He headed for the door, saying that the lightning genius had accomplished a great deed and could rest, while he and Christine would deal with the rest. As the elders moved decisively out of the room, Timothy said that there was no need to go there anymore. They could just send a patrol. People will only be needed there to help remove the bodies of the victims. Christine was the first to look back, not yet suspecting what exactly she would hear from the student. Howard scratched his chin, frowning as he repeated what his friend had just said. Both blues froze, the girl clarified, asking the lightning genius if he wanted to say that he defeated the blood demon with the sword and the sect members single-handedly. He only nodded, confirming that he had killed them all, leaving his mentors in complete shock. Jordan pointed at Timothy, asking again if he had cleared the Blood Flame sect's base alone, and the student said that the movement technique he had shown had been very helpful. Jordan grimaced, and he and Christine exchanged worried glances. The girl looked closely at the student, saying that the blood demon with the sword had an unusual ability to regenerate. Did it really not weaken the young man at all? Timothy looked at his elders with surprise in his eyes, not understanding what they were talking about. It turns out that the blood demon is difficult to defeat, but even those who succeeded often died from a blow to the back, as they were unaware of its ability to regenerate. Walker shrugged. After all, the mentors were telling the truth, but it was strange. He lifted the severed head of the sect leader by the hair and placed it on the table. Allowing himself to smile, the guy said that he hadn't even noticed such an ability in the monster. Both elders opened their mouths, looking first at the head, then at the thoughtful student. Jordan shook his head and just chuckled nervously, not knowing what to say here. The company could barely contain their laughter as they offered to admire the blood demon's regenerative abilities. 10 days later, the company returned to the desolate fortress, and the leader Magwanig called the elders to his office. He did not expect that in such a simple mission, the group would encounter a blood demon. Perhaps it was even for the best, since this way his team prevented many deaths. Christine looked at Theodore guiltily. Jordan stood at a distance and looked away. The man asked how the lightning genius behaved in a critical situation. Christine felt awkward and looked at Jordan, who seemed unfazed. He raised an eyebrow and scratched his chin, asking what the leader meant. He insisted that such a strong leader of the blood cult was dangerous for a newcomer in white robes. Could the elders really have handled everything themselves so as not to endanger the younger one? Christine hesitated, replying that they hadn't seen anything. The lightning genius had gone into the grove alone and returned with news of the cult's offshoot being destroyed. Theodore looked silently at the blue ones, waiting for an explanation while they remained silent. Finally, he frowned, asking if Timothy had really destroyed everything there on his own, including the blood demon with the sword. Jordan muttered uncertainly that that was how it was, but Christine didn't dare speak up. The leader's face was scary to look at. Once in their rooms, the younger ones decided to rest. Timothy stood by the window and looked at the night settlement. Howard sprawled out on the bed, glad to be back. It seemed like the guy had become very attached to this place. He asked young Master Timothy mysteriously if he didn't think there was some kind of commotion going on around him. He listened, assuming there was a festival going on, but Howard shook his head. It turns out that the former leader of the Divine Sword Squad is returning. The friend smirked, saying that the leader had come to challenge for the position of council elder. He also brought with him a boy who was said to have been adopted into the famous Parsons family, and who possesses extraordinary talent. Timothy turned to the window and frowned. The Parsons family was his mother's family, close relatives. But they never visited the boy's homeland, neither when his mother got married, nor after she gave birth to him and left. For them, her marriage is just a reason for reproach because they almost broke off ties with their daughter, who married a lowborn man. A little later, Timothy came to the headmaster's office. The teacher called him in for a talk. He turned to the guy, began to frown at him, and remained silent. Theodore admired the student. Even his aura had changed by this moment. Still, destroying a branch of the blood cult alone can't be just luck. Theodore stood up and called Timothy to follow him. The head calls him to him. Walker was surprised by this news and immediately remembered the piercing green eyes. He immediately exhaled with concern, looking at the back of the teacher leaving the office. Timothy asked if the newcomer in white robes had been called back for an audience during the year. Without turning around, the head of ManhwaCapped briefly replied that never before. When the mentor and the newcomer left the building, all the seniors immediately began to look at the junior. They parted to let Timothy pass, discussing among themselves that the lightning genius from ManhwaCapped, who had defeated the blood demon with a sword, was coming. It was hard to believe that the white man killed him himself, because he looked even younger than everyone thought. Naturally, the leader could not help but notice the close attention paid to the student and told him that this was not surprising. If he single-handedly destroyed a branch of the blood cult, it means he is already on par with the masters of the desert fortress. Timothy thought for a moment and said nothing. While they approached the abode of the head of the desert fortress, Walker just muttered something and, without turning around, confidently walked after his mentor. Timothy's perception of time was different from that of others. There was no time to rejoice in successes. If the guy wanted to survive, he had to become the leader of the Divine Sword Squad before turning 20. From white to blue, then to black robes like his mentor Theodore. And finally, past the 17 steps of ManhwaCapped, reaching the purple rank of Divine Sword Squad leader. After several flights of stairs, Theodore and Timothy found themselves in front of a door that was already familiar to the student. The mentor raised his hand to knock, and voices were heard from behind the door. The head of the desert fortress asked if the former leader of the squad had a grandson. He replied that the child of low blood was nothing to the clan. Timothy bit his lip after these words. He didn't react in any way even after the old man laughed at the fact that the boy didn't disgrace the Parsons family. And that was good. The child who was next to the leader is a true heir. Although he is from a side branch, his talent is exceptional. In the silence that followed, the door slowly opened, as if inviting guests to enter. Theodore stepped slightly around the student, seeing his hesitation, and stepped into the corridor first. Timothy followed the mentors but kept a little distance, trying to cope with his nerves. Finally, they appeared before the seated head of the desolate fortress, the former leader of the Divine Sword Squad, and his grandson. Seeing Timothy, the clearly bored head straightened up and smiled at the guy, recognizing him. He swallowed hard, becoming even more agitated but tried not to show it. Having stared at the girl, he seemed to wake up when Theodore folded his hands together in greeting. He bowed and greeted the leader, and his movements were repeated by the student. Through his thick bangs, Timothy looked at the proudly standing old man in bright clothes. It was the former leader of the Divine Sword Squad, his grandfather, who had disowned his grandson. Although the man was many years old, he was a purple-rank greatmaster, surpassing even Theodore. The face, covered with wrinkles, did not lose its grandeur and disdain for those below its rank. The old man turned to Timothy, asking if he was the famous lightning genius from ManhwaCapped. The leader introduced himself as Robert Duvali, the one who once led the Divine Sword Squad. He pointed to his grinning grandson, who would like to wrestle with his gifted peer, so they turned to Timothy. Robert said he was pleased to meet him, and the guy wondered if they recognized him. The head of the desert fortress was silent. She leaned against her bed, watching what was happening with interest. Duvali spoke again, his hands clasped behind his back, and said he had heard rumors about the young apprentice. Such a person could not help but notice the extraordinary aura of the person in front of him. Therefore, raising an eyebrow, he exclaimed that having met him in person, he realized that there was a lot they were not telling him. The guy is really strong, an incredible level for his age. After these words, the former leader's grandson frowned. Timothy, despite everything, bowed respectfully, preparing to introduce himself. He greeted Robert and stated his name, bowing his head low. Hearing this, the old man stroked his beard in confusion, surprised. At that moment, all eyes were turned to Timothy. Only one head smiled slyly. There was a strange silence. Those present wanted to hear an explanation. The former leader no longer concealed his surprise. He frowned and looked strangely at the boy. He suddenly felt uneasy, because if his last name was Walker, then that explained everything. Robert seemed ready to lose consciousness. or beat up the student standing in front of him. Timothy shook his head and confidently replied that he was seeing the man for the first time. Leader Magwanig grimaced just as much as the old man, slowly turning to face his disciple. He immediately turned pale, staring at the boy, not believing what he was saying. As soon as he said that Timothy was his sister's son, the boy pursed his lips, deciding that the mentor had gone crazy.